London, mid-19th century. A city on the rise, quite literally, since the garbage heaps were growing taller than most houses. It was a metropolis of elegance, invention, and smell. The good news, you were alive in one of the most exciting, industrially booming capitals of the modern world. The bad news, so were the fleas, the rats, and about a million other things your nose would rather not identify. London was a city that glittered on top but fermented underneath. Walking down the street wasn't so much a stroll as it was a survival test. You'd dodge horse dung, puddles of mysterious origin, and the occasional flying bucket emptied from an upper window with the warning shout of Gardez l'eau, French for watch out for the water, though locals learned it really meant incoming toilet. The streets were lined with a concoction of mud, manure, and everything humanity could produce but didn't want to see again. If smell were an Olympic sport, as one might say, London would have taken gold, silver, and bronze without breaking a sweat. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Thames River, once romanticised by poets, had become the city's personal chamber pot. It didn't so much flow as it burped. From a distance it shimmered beautifully in the sun. Up close it was a broth of decay, animal carcasses, and human waste that could singe your nose hairs at 20 paces. A good breeze off the river could ruin your lunch before you even knew what you were smelling. And yet this was home to more than 2 million people, a number growing faster than the city's capacity to deal with, let's call it organic leftovers. Londoners adapted, because what else could they do? The wealthy lit scented candles, the middle class hung lavender sachets, and the poor just held their breath. It was a city divided not only by class, but also by fragrance. The rich smelled like roses trying to fight off rot, while the poor smelled like survival. At night, the atmosphere thickened. Coal smoke from thousands of chimneys mixed with the city's natural perfumes, forming a fog so dense it could qualify as a solid. Lanterns flickered like dim hope through the haze. It was the kind of darkness that made every sound louder, the creak of carts, the slosh of buckets, the distant cry of a drunk who misjudged the curb and fell into a ditch of things best left undescribed. London's booming economy had produced more goods, more buildings, and unfortunately more waste. Every invention, every new factory, every growing household added to a problem that no one wanted to look at but everyone could smell. For centuries, waste management had been somebody else's problem. Now it was everybody's. The city was suffocating under its own success. The irony was almost poetic. This was the era of progress, railways, telegraphs, and mechanised industry. And yet most citizens still relied on chamber pots and backyard cesspits that would overflow after a rain. Progress was measured in steam engines and sewers equally, though London hadn't realised that second part yet. The Industrial Revolution had brought wealth, but it also brought an urban population that lived closer together than ever before, and that meant waste concentrated like never before. The Thames was not only the city's drainage system, but also its drinking supply. Imagine sipping a cup of tea made with the same water that carried last week's laundry, last night's soup, and someone else's business. The people didn't need epidemiology to know something was wrong. Taste it. But for now, the general belief was that bad smells themselves caused disease. The worse the stink, the more dangerous the air, which meant London wasn't just gross, it was terrifying. In the summertime, the smell grew unbearable. Heat transformed the Thames into a rotting stew, the city into a simmering pot of humanity. Newspapers wrote of pestilential vapours. Windows were sealed, curtains soaked in vinegar, and Parliament considered relocating altogether. Those who could afford to leave town fled to the countryside, those who couldn't simply prayed for rain to dampen the air, or their sense of smell. Still, life went on. Markets bustled, carriages clattered, and children played in alleys that no one should have played in. Street vendors called out their wares. competing with the cries of night soil men and the splash of sewage being dumped into the nearest gutter. It was chaos, but it was home. To be Victorian was to endure, and to do it politely. So here stood London, magnificent and miserable, elegant and odorous, a city both admired and pitied. Behind every silk hat and corset was the same unavoidable truth. There was no such thing as a clean corner. And this, dear listener, was the stage upon which one of the most unglamorous revolutions in human history would unfold, a revolution that didn't march or shout, but rather flushed. Before the miracle of plumbing turned waste into water's problem, Victorian London relied on something far less glamorous, the cesspit. These were essentially backyard basements for bodily regrets, deep holes dug in the ground, lined with bricks if you were fancy, and with dirt if you weren't. Every home had one. It was the Victorian version of a personal storage system, except instead of old furniture and bad decisions, it stored everything your digestive system didn't want anymore. The cesspit was a ticking olfactory bomb. At first, it worked fine. You do your business in a chamber pot, pour it into the pit and call it a night. But with every meal and every flush of household waste, it filled up, slowly, quietly, until one day your backyard began to bubble like a witch's cauldron. Rain made it worse, soaking the ground and flooding cesspits, until the contents seeped into cellars, gardens, and sometimes the neighbour's dinner table. That mystery damp on the basement wall? Best not to ask. Victorians were masters of denial. The polite fiction was that once waste disappeared into a pit, it ceased to exist. This was the same logic people use when pushing things under their bed. Except this time it was human waste, and the consequences were biological rather than aesthetic. The smell was a part of life, an unspoken background note, like the smell of coal or wet wool, except far more aggressive. People even had a vocabulary for it. Nuisances, miasmas, or the genteel effluvia. In other words, it stinks, but let's not ruin dinner by saying so. Every household had its own chamber pots, ceramic bowls kept discreetly under beds or chairs. In the middle of the night, you'd reach for it like a sleepy gunslinger and hope your aim was true. There was no greater betrayal than mistaking your chamber pot for someone else's, or realising the maid forgot to empty it. And oh, the maids. Emptying chamber pots was the least glamorous job in a hierarchy already designed to humiliate. They carried full pots down narrow stairways every morning, praying they wouldn't trip. The clang of porcelain at dawn was the city's unofficial alarm clock. For the poor who had neither servants nor privacy, communal cesspits were the only option. Dozens of families shared one, their waste piling up into what could charitably be described as a democratic disaster. When it overflowed, no one claimed responsibility. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Filth soaked into wells and groundwater, creating an invisible cycle of contamination. One sip of water could contain traces of an entire neighbourhood. London was a city unknowingly drinking itself. Then came the night soil men, the unsung heroes of the underworld. Their job was simple, though nothing about it was pleasant. Descend into cesspits at night, shovel out the muck, and cart it away before dawn. They were the city's stealthiest workers, operating when everyone else was asleep. If you ever wondered who emptied your pit while you slumbered, it was them. These men were ghosts of necessity, armed with buckets, shovels, and stomachs made of iron. The pay was meagre, the risk enormous. Methane and hydrogen sulfide built up in sealed pits, turning every descent into a gamble with suffocation. A single spark or sun from a candle or a lantern could ignite the gases in an explosive farewell. There were documented cases where a cesspit, long sealed and neglected, suddenly detonated, launching its contents skyward. Imagine explaining that insurance claim. Yet night soil men persisted. They moved silently through alleyways, pushing carts full of what they euphemistically called the product. Some sold it to farmers outside London as fertiliser, the ultimate recycling programme. The waste of the city became the food of the countryside, completing a grim but practical cycle of life. Your waste had a more active nightlife than you did, as one might say. and it certainly travelled farther. The smell followed them everywhere. No soap could hide it. They were avoided in pubs, shunned on streets, and paid in cash so no one had to touch their hands. Still, they provided a vital service. Without them, the city would have drowned in its own excrement decades before Bazalgette's sewers arrived. Meanwhile, the middle and upper classes pretended this entire system didn't exist. Architects designed elaborate townhouses with elegant drawing rooms and hidden waste closets, as if hiding the cesspit made it less real. The wealthy might have had larger pits or hired more frequent cleanings, but even their fortunes couldn't buy fresh air. In truth, every home was connected underground by a network of rot, invisible, intimate, and equalizing. Some households resorted to creative solutions. Ash, sand, or even dry earth was poured into pits to reduce the smell. It didn't work, but it gave people the illusion of control, a thin layer of denial over a mountain of decay. Others tried dumping their weight into open drains, letting it flow into the nearest ditch or directly into the Thames. This, of course, was the sanitary equivalent of throwing garbage into your own kitchen sink and wondering why it smells. To live in Victorian London was to coexist with filth so constant that people stopped noticing. Children played near open drains, vendors sold food beside cesspits, and entire communities grew accustomed to breathing through their sleeves. Cleanliness wasn't a habit, it was a fantasy. The city's motto might as well have been, out of sight, out of smell, out of mind. But beneath that complacency, pressure was building, literally. As London's population exploded, so did its waste, and the old systems began to fail catastrophically. Overflowing pits flooded basements, contaminated wells, and triggered outbreaks of mysterious diseases that no one yet understood. People whispered that the city was cursed. The truth was far simpler, was full, and so the cesspit lifestyle, as unsustainable as it was revolting, had reached its limit. The pits were swelling, the air was thickening, and the cracks in London's sanitary illusion were widening fast. What began as a quiet, unseen problem was about to become impossible to ignore. If London had saints, they didn't wear halos. They wore rags, carried shovels, and smelled like a moral lesson. Meet the night soil men, the human vacuum cleaners of Victorian London. By day they were invisible. By night they emerged like spectres from the city's lower intestines, climbing into cesspits armed with buckets, lanterns, and courage that bordered on insanity. Their mission? To rescue London's homes from overflowing shame, a one scoop at a time. The name Night Soil was Victorian politeness at its most creative. It sounded almost rustic, as if these men were collecting something agricultural like moon-grown compost. The reality was far less poetic. They were shoveling human excrement, tons of it, from overflowing cesspits and privies. They operated under cover of darkness not because they were ashamed, but because the smell made daytime impossible. Sunlight turned waste into a chemical weapon, while cool night air made it just bearable enough to work. They didn't have uniforms, only patched clothes so stained they looked waterproof. Their tools were simple, long-handled shovels, wooden buckets, and ropes to hoist the product out of pits. Some wore cloth soaked in vinegar tied around their mouths to blunt the stench, though that only turned the odour into something that could best be described as pickled horror. They were often barefoot or wore boots so degraded they might as well have been. Their lanterns flickered dimly through fog and methane, giving them the appearance of ghosts digging through nightmares. Their work began when everyone else's day ended. Around midnight, carts rolled through the sleeping streets, wheels creaking under the weight of iron barrels. The men moved in teams, silent except for the scrape of metal and the occasional cough, a deep, hollow sound earned from years of inhaling sewer air. They would pry open cesspit covers, climb down ladders into the muck and start shoveling. Sometimes the pits were so deep they needed pulleys to haul up the waste. Other times they waded waist deep, relying on touch rather than sight. They didn't need job titles, their smell introduced them first. They were paid by the load, not the hour. A good night meant several pits cleared, though good was a relative term when your job description included risk of suffocation. Methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide pooled in the pits, invisible killers that could knock a man unconscious in seconds. There were no safety rules, no regulations, and no pity. A man could go down to shovel and never come back up. The next shift might find him days later, preserved by the very filth he'd been trying to remove. But despite the danger, there was a certain pride among night soil men. They performed a task nobody else would. One that kept the city livable, at least marginally. They joked darkly about their profession, inventing slang to make it sound less grim. A full cesspit was a ripe one, a dangerous one was a devil's pocket, and an especially bad shift was a thick night. Their humour was their only perfume. Socially, they occupied the bottom rung of the working class. People crossed the street to avoid them, not out of cruelty, but because proximity came with olfactory consequences. Even freshly washed, if such a thing were possible, they carried the smell like a shadow. It clung to their hair, their skin, their breath. Some claimed they could never taste food properly again, as if their noses had permanently rebelled against flavour. Pubs often refused them entry or made them drink outside. Ironically, while their work protected the public's health, they themselves were treated as walking contagions. And yet the night soil men kept London alive. Without them, cesspits would overflow into homes, streets and wells, unleashing horrors even the most hardened city dwellers couldn't ignore. They were the city's last line of defence against total sensory collapse. The elite might boast of progress and empire, but every mansion, theatre and Parliament Hall owed its sanitation to these unseen men labouring below. Once the waste was collected, it didn't vanish. It went on a night journey of its own. The men hauled it to the outskirts of the city, where it was dumped into barges and transported to farmlands. Farmers bought it cheap as fertiliser, giving birth to the rather unsavoury phrase night soil trade. In a grotesque twist of fate, the food grown with it often returned to London's markets, completing the circle of life and proving nature has a very dark sense of humour. Their profession was inherited. Sons followed fathers into the pits, not out of choice but inevitability. Once you bore the stink, no other trade would have you. Apprentices learned the craft like any other, where to dig, how to avoid collapse, and how to breathe shallowly enough to survive. Some men claimed they could tell the social class of a neighbourhood just by the smell of its cesspits. The rich, apparently, stank of imported food and perfume, the poor of cabbage and coal dust. Everyone in the end smelled mortal. By dawn they would disappear again. The carts rumbled back through silent streets, leaving behind cleaner pits and seeping households who never saw their midnight saviours. When London woke, its citizens went about their day none the wiser, their homes lighter, their air marginally less toxic. The night soil men slept during the day, exhausted and anonymous, their contributions as invisible as the sewers they served. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. No statues were built for them, no poems written in their honour. But without their grim labour, the Victorian metropolis would have drowned long before its great stink. They bore the city's shame and turned it into survival. They were the workers beneath civilization, and though unwashed, they kept it clean enough to function. There comes a point in every city's history when it must face an uncomfortable truth. When your main river starts bubbling like stew, civilization may have gone a bit off recipe. For Victorian London, that moment arrived when the Thames, once a proud, glittering artery of empire, became less a river and more a slow-moving broth of excrement, industrial waste and misplaced optimism. The locals called it the Great River. The rest of the world, if they had smelled it, might have called it the world's largest public toilet. The Thames had always been London's lifeline. It carried goods, powered trade and reflected the glow of progress. But as the city's population ballooned past 2 million, every flush, bucket and drain began emptying into the same place. Cesspits overflowed, drains leaked, and people, eager to be rid of their waste, found the river a convenient accomplice. After all, it was big, wide, and moved in the right direction, away. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. The Thames had become the city's bloodstream, except now it was full of infection. Raw sewage poured in daily, mixing with the runoff from factories, slaughterhouses and tanneries. The result? A rich, brownish cocktail of substances that only a poet on opium could call beautiful. Fish suffocated, algae bloomed, and the water grew thick enough that you could probably butter it on toast. The current no longer sparkled, it oozed. It wasn't just the smell, though, to be fair, the smell alone could peel paint off walls. It was the way the stench seemed to have ambition. It didn't stay politely by the riverbank. It marched inland, sneaking into homes, offices and churches. Sailors who had once braved the world's oceans now gagged crossing London Bridge. The wind carried whispers of despair and other things best left unnamed. Summer heat made it worse, the sun cooking the waste like soup on a low boil. On hot days, people said the river shimmered, not from light, but from gases bubbling up like it was trying to breathe. Yet here's the kicker. This same river supplied London's drinking water. Water companies, with staggering optimism and zero filtration systems, simply scooped it up, piped it to homes and charged a fee. The people drinking it were, in essence, drinking themselves, a level of intimacy no one had asked for. Imagine dipping a cup into a cauldron of filth and calling it hydration. As one could joke, Londoners didn't drink water. They just practiced survival challenges. The results were predictable, though the Victorians didn't yet understand why. Diseases like cholera, dysentery and typhoid ripped through the city. Whole neighbourhoods fell ill, yet the upper classes blamed it on bad air. Miasma, that mysterious invisible menace that conveniently smelled awful. It was the perfect scapegoat. You could blame the smell without acknowledging what caused it. Meanwhile, the real culprit, microscopic bacteria, were thriving, multiplying in every teacup, bath and pitcher. To many, the Thames still held symbolic power. Painters painted it, poets wrote about it, and boatmen rowed across it as if pretending it hadn't turned into soup. But everyone knew. Newspapers began publishing alarming descriptions. A pestilential stream, the Great Sewer of London, a river of liquid death. Diplomats from abroad reported that meetings near the river were unbearable. One visitor claimed that standing too long on Westminster Bridge made his eyes water and his soul reconsider its life choices. The river wasn't just disgusting, it was a civic embarrassment. Parliament, seated elegantly near the Thames, began to notice that its sessions were getting shorter. Not because debates were improving, but because no one could breathe. Curtains were soaked in lime chloride to mask the odour. Members pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. Some even dipped their beards in perfume-soaked vinegar before entering chambers. In the summer of 1858, the stench became so overwhelming that lawmakers nearly relocated the entire government inland. The press called it the Great Stink. And though that phrase properly belongs to a later moment of crisis, this chapter of the story was its prelude, a warning that the Thames had gone from waterway to warning sign. The tragedy of it all was how ordinary it became. Londoners adapted, as humans do. They learned to live with it, to joke about it, to breathe through their sleeves and keep walking. The wealthy installed private wells, the poor prayed their water wouldn't kill them before their rent did, and everyone quietly pretended that it was fine. Because acknowledging the truth meant realising the city itself had become unsustainable. Industry didn't help. Factories dumped chemical runoff and animal remains straight into the river. Tanneries washed hides in its waters, breweries disposed of spoiled mash, and slaughterhouses poured blood and fat into the current. Imagine walking along the riverbank and seeing a foam of reddish-brown scum forming like a grotesque cappuccino. Seagulls refused to land. Even dogs hesitated before swimming. And still, ferrymen rowed through it, whistling because work was work and noses apparently could adapt. Yet for all its filth, the Thames remained essential. It carried goods, it defined the city's geography, and it provided the illusion of continuity, that life went on. People still gathered at its banks for festivals, unaware that beneath the ripples lay layers of rot. The Thames wasn't just a river, it was London's mirror. And by the mid-1800s, that reflection, wasn't flattering. The city's water crisis was no longer a question of comfort, but of survival. Scientists were beginning to suspect that disease came not from the air, but from the water itself. The connection between sewage and sickness was becoming harder to ignore. But changing minds and infrastructure in a city built on centuries of denial would take time. The Thames had become London's dirtiest secret, flowing right through the heart of empire. It would take more than prayers, perfume, or polite ignorance to clean it. It would take disaster, and a man with the courage to face the stink head-on. But for now, the river boiled, the city drank, and the people lived their lives in the shadow of their own making. A civilization afloat on soup. In the grand catalogue of Victorian horrors, few terrors matched the arrival of cholera, the disease that seemed to glide in silently, strike without mercy, and vanish before anyone knew what had happened. It was the perfect villain for the age, invisible, unstoppable, and armed with a speed that mocked both prayer and science. One day your neighbour was fine, the next he was blue, bloated and gone. It didn't care about class, manners, or how many lavender sachets you'd hung in your parlour. Cholera was democracy in its most lethal full form. The first great epidemic arrived in 1832, imported from the Indian subcontinent through global trade routes, proof that empire didn't just export tea and textiles, but imported terror in return. By the time it reached London, it travelled faster than gossip. Within weeks, thousands were dead. The victim began with stomach cramps and vomiting, followed by dehydration so severe their skin shrank and their eyes sank like stones. Within hours, the body turned grey-blue, as if death itself had taken up painting. No one knew what caused it. Doctors debated theories like philosophers arguing over ghosts. The dominant belief was miasma, the idea that bad air carried disease. And given the smells in London, that theory felt emotionally satisfying. The logic was simple. If something stank, it must be deadly. If it smelled nice, it was probably safe. Thus, Victorians armed themselves with posies, vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs, and a firm belief that disease could be warded off with perfume. Victorians blamed the air, as one might say, which, to be fair, was guilty of many crimes. Miasma theory shaped everything. Streets were cleaned not to remove germs, no one believed in those yet, but to remove the odour of decay. Doctors recommended moving hospitals to breezier locations, as if fresh air alone could bully disease into leaving. The wealthy fled to the countryside, thinking rural breezes could outwit cholera's grasp. Meanwhile, the poor had no such luxury. They stayed in overcrowded slums, where open drains, shared pumps and contaminated wells became the perfect breeding grounds for what scientists hadn't yet learned to call bacteria. Newspapers were filled with panic. Headlines screamed of the Blue Death, a poetic name for something utterly unromantic. Fear infected the city as thoroughly as the disease itself. People blamed foreigners, the poor, the rich, even divine punishment. Moralists declared that cholera was a heavenly warning about sin, especially the kind that involved gin. Pamphlets urged repentance and cleaner living, though ironically few mentioned cleaner water. Doctors were as helpless as their patients. Medical treatments were a blend of superstition, guesswork and optimism. Some prescribed brandy, others prescribed bleeding. One recommended mustard poultices. Another suggested laudanum, which mostly ensured that patients died unconscious. Public health was, at this stage, less a science and more an experimental art form conducted by men with impressive facial hair and limited evidence. But cholera didn't care for theories. It cared for plumbing. The disease spread through contaminated water, though no one yet believed it. It clung to the pumps and pipes that brought Londoners their daily drink. In the poorest districts where sewage seeped into wells, entire families vanished in days. Children perished first, their smaller bodies overwhelmed. Mothers followed soon after, leaving fathers to stare helplessly at their collapsing households. In one notorious outbreak, entire streets were wiped out before officials even realised the scale. The city reeked of panic and disinfectant. Lime was poured into drains, tar was burned in barrels to purify the air, and vinegar sales skyrocketed. The wealthy bought gas masks shaped like beaks, resembling medieval plague doctors, because if you're going to die, you might as well look mysterious doing it. Priests performed last rites in bulk, their voices trembling under the smell of carbolic acid and despair. And still, no one touched the real culprit, the water supply. Water companies continued pumping directly from the Thames, that same brown soup where waste and disease danced a grim waltz. Engineers proudly declared their pipes modern marvels, ignoring that they were delivering bottled cholera to half the city. If modernity had a smell, it was death diluted in river water. By 1848, the epidemic struck again, and then again in the 1850s. Each wave seemed worse than the last. The numbers blurred into the statistics, and the city learned to normalise catastrophe. Cemeteries overflowed. Gravediggers worked around the clock, and still bodies piled up faster than they could bury them. Entire neighbourhoods became ghost towns, not from quarantine, but because everyone inside had died. Yet amid this chaos, a few curious minds began to suspect the truth. One of them, a certain Dr. John Snow, quietly questioned whether cholera might come not from the air, but from what people were drinking. He noticed clusters of deaths around particular pumps, a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Though his full investigation would come later, the seed of scientific rebellion had been planted. But for now, the establishment clung to the comforting fiction of bad air. After all, blaming the smell didn't require rebuilding the city's entire infrastructure. The irony of cholera's reign was that it exposed how thin the veneer of civilization really was. Beneath the carriages, corsets, and candlelit banquets lay a city fundamentally unclean. Londoners had built an empire that spanned the globe, yet couldn't make their own drinking water safe. The disease was not just biological, it was moral. It mocked the arrogance of progress and exposed the fragility of comfort. By the end of each outbreak, those who survived carried invisible scars. They had watched neighbours turn blue, smelled death in the air, and understood, even if only instinctively, that something in the city itself was poisoned. But they didn't yet know how deep that poison ran, in their wells, their pipes, their institutions, and their beliefs. Cholera was the teacher no one wanted but everyone needed. It whispered through London's gutters a single truth. The city's greatest enemy wasn't poverty or plague, but denial. And soon denial would meet its match, in the form of engineers, reformers, and one very determined doctor with a map. Long before bacteria entered the chat, Victorians waged their war on disease using the only weapon they believed in: perfume. If you could smell it, they reasoned, it could kill you. And if you could cover the smell with something floral, well, congratulations, you'd just defeated science with potpourri. This was the golden age of the miasma theory, the deeply held conviction that bad air was the root of all evil. To the Victorians, a foul stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was malevolent, a visible sign that Death himself had opened a window somewhere in Southwark. The logic made sense, in a terrible nose-based way. London stank. The Thames gurgled with filth, drains belched methane, and every breeze carried a whiff of something that made your ancestors reconsider evolution. To live in such a place and not assume the air was trying to murder you required either scientific foresight or complete nasal surrender. Most people chose flowers. Doctors led the charge in this olfactory crusade. Learned men with impressive moustaches prescribed scent the way modern physicians prescribe antibiotics. Vinegar vapours were purifying, camphor was restorative, and burning incense was believed to drive away corruption. You might see a physician stride through a slum holding a posy to his nose like a man politely rejecting reality. Hospitals reeked of lavender oil and disinfectant, a combination that, if nothing else, gave patients a choice of how to faint. Nothing says health like sniffing lavender while standing over a corpse. This war on stench spawned a booming new industry: Every household from mansion to tenement developed its own odour defence strategy. Wealthy families stuffed their halls with rosewater and citrus oil, while the middle class resorted to vinegar bowls and hastily burned coffee grounds. The poor relied on cheap tobacco, hoping smoke might outmuscle the miasmas before rent was due. London became a city of dueling smells, decay versus desperation, overlaid with perfumes so thick it could choke an opera singer. Inventors leapt at the opportunity. Patent offices overflowed with bizarre air purifiers. One popular device resembled a helmet that filtered air through perfumed sponges. Think of it as the world's first scented gas mask, perfect for strolling through death zones in style. Another involved carrying a tiny cage of burning herbs around your neck, like a portable campfire for your nostrils. Some people even filled hollow walking canes with camphor and sniffed them discreetly between sentences, giving rise to the phrase taking the air, which in practice meant pretending not to gag. Public spaces became scent battlegrounds. Streets were sprinkled with lime, gutters flooded with carbolic acid, and open drains smoked from tar fires meant to purify the atmosphere. The city smelled like a mixture of burnt toast, vinegar salad, and despair. Churches swung incense censers with newfound enthusiasm, both to sanctify the soul and to mask the dead rat under the pew. Public officials ordered barrels of burning pitch to line the Thames embankment, hoping to outstink the stink. It didn't work. The smell simply evolved. To the Victorians, this olfactory obsession wasn't just about health. It was moral. Good smells equaled good character. Bad smells equaled sin. If you reeked, you were suspect. Entire classes of people, the poor, the labourers, the fishmongers, were assumed unhealthy simply because of their scent. The working class didn't just live near disease, they were disease in polite society's imagination. Clean air became a symbol of virtue, while foul air became a metaphor for moral decay. The wealthy didn't merely flee the city for the countryside to escape infection, they fled to escape guilt. Meanwhile, reformers campaigned for sanitary air with near-religious zeal. Committees were formed, reports were written, and parliaments debated the best way to bottle purity. One enthusiastic official proposed pumping ozone into homes to neutralise bad vapours, an idea that sounded impressive and achieved nothing. Another insisted Londoners should carry bouquets wherever they went. Flower girls, once street ornaments, became public health warriors in petticoats. At home, domestic rituals became miniature battles against invisible gas demons. Curtains were soaked in vinegar, floors scrubbed with lye, windows opened daily to release foul airs and invite in whatever new ones drifted by. Perfumed soaps sold out faster than political promises. Women pinned scented sachets to their corsets, while men dabbed cologne on their cravats like it was armour. Even funerals got a makeover. Caskets were lined with charcoal and herbs to contain the emanations of the deceased. Nothing said final farewell, like a lavender-scented corpse. But if miasma theory was nonsense, it was at least productive nonsense. The obsession with cleaning, scrubbing and deodorizing had side effects, namely, it accidentally made things cleaner. Streets were flushed, drains repaired and homes ventilated. Though Victorians did it for the wrong reasons, they stumbled toward genuine public health improvements out of sheer terror of their own noses. It was science by accident, progress achieved through perfume. Still the delusion persisted, even as evidence began to mount that disease travelled by water, not air. Many clung to the old belief. After all, the air was everywhere, and easier to blame than plumbing. Accepting the truth meant admitting that the very pipes and pumps that symbolised modern progress were instruments of death. It was far more comforting to believe that cholera floated on a foul breeze than to realise you'd been drinking it with breakfast. By the 1850s, London had become an olfactory circus, a city drenched in its own paranoia. Perfume bottles lined shop windows beside gas masks, and citizens debated whether to trust lavender, vinegar, or simply divine intervention. Miasma wasn't just a theory, it was an entire cultural identity. a nose-first philosophy that shaped architecture, etiquette, and even fashion. Parasols, gloves, and handkerchiefs weren't merely stylish. They were weapons in the war against invisible vapours. Yet beneath the rosewater and incense, something deeper was beginning to stir, a quiet rebellion led by skeptics who dared to question the nose-based empire of disease. Among them was a doctor who thought in maps instead of smells, who didn't trust perfume to solve pandemics, and who would soon make London see and smell the truth. But until that day, the Victorians continued their fragrant delusion, standing proudly in clouds of lavender and ignorance, convinced they could outsniff death itself. For all their silk waistcoats, mahogany staircases, and armies of servants, the Victorian upper class could not buy immunity from the one tyrant that ruled London equally: smell. The stench of the city. That democratic disaster cared nothing for social rank. It drifted past marble gates and velvet drapes, laughing as it crept beneath the polished doors of the rich. You could own 10 estates and half of India, but one hot summer day near the Thames, and your home would smell like a public confession. To understand the aristocratic odour crisis, one must first picture the architecture of privilege. Georgian and early Victorian townhouses were triumphs of symmetry and self-deception, grand facades masking a series of tiny disasters. Most of them were built over cesspits, because even dukes had to deposit somewhere. The difference was merely decorative. The poor had backyard holes. The rich had indoor plumbing that led straight to larger, better disguised holes. These were often located directly beneath kitchens or servants' quarters, a grim irony when dinner smells mingled with other aromas rising from below. Early indoor plumbing was considered the ultimate luxury. Having a water closet inside your house was the equivalent of owning a private jet today, flashy, expensive, and slightly dangerous. Pipes were temperamental creatures. They gurgled, they groaned, and when the pressure built up just right, they could quite literally explode. Nothing humbles a duke faster than a surprise flush from below. It happened often enough that polite society developed an unspoken understanding. When visiting someone's home, avoid sitting too close to the lavatory wall. You never knew what might decide to make an entrance. The trouble lay in physics. Those elegant cast-iron pipes carried not just waste but also methane and hydrogen sulfide, gases that had no respect for titles. Without proper vents or traps, pressure built up until it found a way out, often with theatrical force. A single candle placed too near a closet opening could ignite the fumes. There are records of bathrooms detonating like small artillery pieces, scattering porcelain, shrapnel and pride in equal measure. The Times once reported a fatal commotion in Belgravia when a servant attempted to light a lamp and instead launched the entire privy into the ceiling. Servants bore the brunt of these disasters. They were responsible for maintaining the temperamental plumbing systems, which meant spending hours down in damp basements among leaking pipes and suspicious puddles. For all the grandeur above, the lower floors of these homes resembled miniature underworlds, hot, dark and humming with a symphony of drip, gurgle, and occasional scream. The staff developed a sixth sense for pressure build-up. If a pipe hissed or a wall quivered, they knew to run. Those who didn't learn fast enough were remembered in the footnotes of engineering journals as unfortunate incidents. The upper class, meanwhile, treated odour as a matter of etiquette rather than biology. When something smelled wrong, they didn't call a doctor, they called a perfumer. Drawing rooms were drenched in rose oil, and hallways smoked with burning pastilles. Fancy households ordered their scents from Paris, believing French air in a old bottle could overpower English rot. The result was chemical warfare. Guests would arrive to find salons fogged in frankincense and jasmine, the air so thick you could slice it with a spoon. Breathing was optional, but compliments were mandatory. Then there were the sanitary reforms of the rich, architectural attempts to outwit physics. Engineers designed elaborate double-trap drains, airtight chambers and mechanical flushers that promised freshness forever. Those didn't work. Some merely rerouted the smell from one part of the house to another, so it was not uncommon for a gentleman's study to suddenly acquire the scent of a bathroom 3 floors down. This was the era when technology outpaced understanding, when plumbing was as much art as hazard. The wealthy also tried spatial solutions. Country estates were considered healthier, their bathrooms built in detached wings to prevent odour from invading the main residence. But in London, where every square foot was a symbol of status, space was scarce. So people built upward, adding floors upon floors and cesspits upon cesspits. Waste didn't vanish, it merely relocated, like an embarrassed guest pretending to leave a party but lingering in the hall. Odour, of course, became a class weapon. The poor smelled because they had to. The rich smelled because they refused to admit they did. There was a hierarchy even to stench. A coal-scented labourer was pitied, but a perfumed nobleman with a rotting drain was tragicomic. Gossip columns occasionally hinted at unwholesome atmospheres in certain mansions, a coded way of saying that Lord So-and-so's water closet had rebelled. London society could forgive scandal, but not a smell. In desperation, the fashionable turned to science, or what passed for it. Advertisements promised anti-miasmatic crystals, atmospheric disinfectors, and odourless earth closets. Some of these inventions genuinely improved sanitation. Others were little more than scented talismans. One eccentric baronet even installed a fountain in his hall that sprayed eucalyptus water into the air at regular intervals. Guests emerged smelling like cough drops, but the man swore by its power. Despite all this luxury, the anxiety persisted. The rich lived in a kind of perfumed paranoia, forever suspecting their own homes of betrayal. Servants were instructed to sniff drains daily, report any vapour anomalies, and burn incense on command. At dinner parties, the conversation often drifted from art and politics to sewage, whispered fears of smells rising through the floorboards. Beneath the chandeliers and champagne, the true guest of honour was always dread. But there was one small mercy in all this farce. Fear of miasma made the wealthy demand real change. When Parliament eventually approved London's great sewer works, it wasn't out of compassion for the poor, it was because the upper class had finally realised the stink had no respect for wealth. Disease, after all, did not recognise a title deed. A single breeze could carry the same fate to Mayfair as to Whitechapel. And so the dukes and duchesses, who once perfumed their halls with roses, unwittingly financed the engineering revolution that would save their noses and everyone else's. The lesson was bitter but lasting. All the money in the world couldn't buy fresh air when your city was fermenting beneath your feet. It began with sunshine, a bright, innocent English summer, the kind painters loved and poets lied about. The skies over London glowed a soft gold, the Thames shimmered like a ribbon of light, and for one brief moment the city looked almost beautiful. Then the heat settled in, the wind died, and the river began to cook. Within days the Thames was no longer a river. It was an open-air stewpot of human history. Every bucket of waste, every dead undead dog, every forgotten barrel of rot that had been dumped over decades now rose from the depths in aromatic revenge. By late June, London wasn't breathing air, it was inhaling soup. The newspapers called it the Great Stink, though that phrase hardly did it justice. This wasn't just a bad smell. This was a full sensory assault, a fog of putrefaction so thick it seemed to have texture. The heat intensified it until the Thames gurgled like something alive. At low tide, the mud banks bubbled ominously, releasing clouds of gas that clung to clothes, furniture, and human dignity alike. The smell didn't just linger, it followed. Those who lived near the river found themselves under siege. Curtains soaked in lime chloride were hung across windows, doused daily in chemicals that stung the eyes and offered only brief relief. Newspapers advised citizens to burn tar, sprinkle carbolic acid, or hang vinegar-soaked sponges in their rooms. A few bold souls tried smoking cigars as a defence, only to discover that the stench could outfight tobacco. In the words of one disgusted editor, "It is impossible to exaggerate the stench," which, in Victorian journalism, meant they had definitely tried. The Thames wasn't so much flowing as fermenting. Bargemen refused to work, fishermen just gave up entirely, and water companies, with the audacity of eternal optimism, continued pumping the same foul liquid into people's homes. The press had a field day. The Times described the river as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horror. Punch magazine, never missing a chance for satire, published cartoons of the Thames as a corpse, Parliament holding its nose beside it. The river had finally achieved celebrity status as London's most powerful political lobbyist. Indeed, it was the politicians who suffered most, and for once the nation rejoiced in their misery. The Palace of Westminster stood proudly on the Thames embankment, prime waterfront real estate for stench. The new Gothic building, completed only a few years earlier, had been designed for grandeur, not ventilation. Its tall windows trapped the odour like a cathedral traps incense. Inside, MPs gagged through sessions, dabbing perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, eyes watering as they debated the nation's future while marinating in its past. Members of Parliament tried everything short of divine intervention. Lime chloride was poured into the drains, hundreds of gallons at a time, but it barely dented the miasma. One MP suggested stretching canvas soaked in chemicals across the windows. Another proposed moving sessions to Oxford, or even the countryside until the atmosphere improved. The Prime Minister himself was seen escaping meetings with his hat pressed over his nose, which at least proved he had a nose. When politicians finally smelled the problem, as one might put it, reform became very urgent. For decades, London's sanitation had been politely ignored, an issue of engineers, not statesmen. But now the stench was bipartisan. It didn't matter whether one sat on the left or the right. Everyone sat above the same river. The Great Stink was democracy in its purest form. No one could escape it. The public watched gleefully as Parliament squirmed. Letters poured into newspapers demanding action. Satirical pamphlets mocked the lawmakers for only noticing the problem once it reached their nostrils. The people have smelt it for years, one writer quipped. But now the House of Commons has joined the Commons House. Still between jokes and chemical burns, something remarkable happened. The government moved, not gracefully, but decisively. An emergency bill was introduced to fund the creation of a massive modern sewer system for the entire city, a project so ambitious it seemed impossible. But the alternative was unthinkable. The Great Stink had turned the Thames into a threat not only to public health but to governance itself. The choice was simple: build sewers or abandon Westminster. Parliament chose the former, though perhaps only because they couldn't relocate the entire empire inland. The man who would save London's nose, Joseph Bazalgette, was waiting in the wings, blueprint in hand. His engineering brilliance would transform the disaster into triumph. But in 1858 his plans were still lines on paper, and London still stank like a civilization in decay. The Great Stink was the slap that woke the empire from its perfumed denial. For the people living through it, though, daily life was an endurance trial. Mothers stuffed wet towels under door frames. Clerks fainted at their desks. Even Queen Victoria cancelled a pleasure cruise on the Thames after one whiff convinced her that monarchy had limits. Doctors claimed the heat and stench were producing nervous disorders, a polite way of saying people were losing their minds. The city's moral fabric seemed to melt in the heat, and perhaps it did chemically. Then, as suddenly as it came, the crisis ebbed. Cooler weather arrived, the river's bubbling subsided, and London exhaled. But the damage was done. The Great Stink had seared itself into public memory. It was proof that progress had limits, that an empire could conquer continents but not its own waste. The Victorians had finally looked into the mirror of their civilization and found it floating, quite literally, in the Thames. What made the event legendary wasn't just the smell, it was the moment a city faced its own reflection and decided to evolve. Out of stench came sanitation, out of embarrassment, innovation. And if history ever needed a punchline, it was this. It took the unbearable smell of sewage to make London civilised. If London had a superhero, He didn't wear tights, carry a sword, or swing from rooftops. He wore a waistcoat, carried a slide rule, and spent most of his career thinking about other people's waste. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, and while he never fought villains, he fought something far worse, the collective byproduct of an empire that had been flushing in denial for 2 centuries. He didn't wear a cape, but his sewers did save millions of rears. When Bazalgette entered the scene, London was still reeling from the great stink. Politicians had fled, newspapers had roasted Parliament like a rotten herring, and the people were desperate for someone, anyone, who could make the city breathable again. Enter a soft-spoken engineer with a brilliant mind, a stubborn sense of duty, and the kind of patience only a man designing a 1,300-mile sewage network could possess. Born in 1809, Bazalgette came from a family of French Huguenot refugees, proof that nothing says "thank you, Britain" like cleaning up its capital. He trained as a civil engineer, building railways and drainage systems long before anyone thought sanitation could sound heroic. By the time he became chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856, London's infrastructure was a jigsaw puzzle of pipes, puddles, and poor decisions. The city's drains had evolved haphazardly, a Frankenstein's monster of brick tunnels that carried rainwater, waste, and despair in equal measure. Bazalgette looked at this chaos and saw not filth but opportunity. His vision was as simple as it was monumental. Build a grand underground system that would collect all of London's waste and send it far downstream, away from homes, drinking water, and polite society. In short, take the problem no one wanted to face and bury it beautifully. The idea wasn't new, but Bazalgette's scale was revolutionary. He didn't just design sewers, he designed civilization with better plumbing. To appreciate his genius, imagine what he faced. London's streets were crowded, its soil unpredictable, and its population exploding faster than engineers could lay bricks. He needed tunnels big enough to handle not just the current waste, but that of future generations. So he did the unthinkable. He overbuilt. Each sewer was designed nearly twice as large as the city's needs at the time, a decision mocked by his contemporaries but vindicated by history. Over a century and a half later, those same tunnels are still in use. When asked how he knew to build them so big, one might imagine Bazalgette shrugging modestly and saying, "Because people always produce more than expected." The project was a masterpiece of logistics. Over 82 miles of main-borne intercepting sewers, hundreds of miles of smaller drains, and millions of bricks, all carefully laid by hand. The great pipes ran beneath the city like arteries of brick and mortar, sloping just enough so gravity did most of the work. It was as much art as science, a subterranean cathedral dedicated to cleanliness. The construction was perilous. Workers toiled in darkness, knee-deep in sludge and water, their only light the flicker of oil lamps. Explosions from trapped gases were not uncommon. The stench was constant. Yet despite the danger, morale remained high. Many labourers spoke with pride about their work. After all, they weren't just building tunnels, they were rescuing London from itself. It was one of those rare moments in history when digging through filth felt like moral progress. Bazalgette's leadership was firm but humane. He treated his workers with respect, ensuring safety standards that were, for the time, almost revolutionary. He visited sites personally, boots muddy, taking measurements and making adjustments. His reputation for calm competence earned him the loyalty of his crews and the grudging admiration of politicians who barely understood the magnitude of what he was doing. While others panicked or postured, Bazalgette simply built. And what he built changed everything. By 1865, the main sewers were complete, enormous brick tunnels running along both sides of the Thames, hidden beneath new embankments that doubled as roads and walkways. The Victoria, Albert and Chelsea embankments weren't just urban beautification, they were sanitary fortifications. Under their stately facades flowed the lifeblood of a healthier city, or more precisely, the opposite of lifeblood. The smell diminished, the water cleared, and disease rates began to plummet. When the system officially opened, it wasn't with fanfare but quiet relief. London could breathe again. The politicians congratulated each other. The newspapers hailed a triumph of engineering, and Bazalgette accepted it all with characteristic modesty. He didn't crave glory, he craved efficiency. The well-being of millions, he wrote dryly, depends on the perfection of a few pipes. He might as well have added, and on one man's refusal to let the city drown in its own waste. The impact of his work went far beyond odour control. Cholera outbreaks ceased almost overnight, proving that disease travelled through water, not air, though Bazalgette himself remained politely silent as his sewers demolished decades of medical dogma. Public health improved, life expectancy rose, and London's reputation transformed from cautionary tale to modern marvel. Clean streets became a symbol of progress, and the word sanitation entered the vocabulary of civilization. Bazalgette became Sir Joseph in 1874, knighted for his service to public health, a rare honour for a man whose kingdom existed entirely underground. His network would inspire similar systems around the world, from Paris to New York, setting the global standard for urban hygiene. Ironically, most of the people he saved never knew his name. They walked the streets above his tunnels, unaware that every step rested on the quiet genius of a man who turned filth into function. He died in 1891, long after the Great Stink had become history, but his legacy endured in every clean glass of water and every disease that never happened. His epitaph might have been simple: he made London bearable. Few heroes can claim such an achievement, because in the end, Joseph Bazalgette didn't just save London's nose, he saved its future. The empire may have conquered continents, but he conquered something far more difficult: the human tendency to ignore its own mess. If Joseph Bazalgette's vision had a heartbeat, it pulsed beneath London's feet, a labyrinth of tunnels so vast, so precisely built, that even the rats must have applauded. His grand sewer network wasn't just plumbing, it was urban anatomy. London, for all its fog and fashion, was about to grow a new set of organs, and Bazalgette would be its surgeon, laying down arteries of brick and mortar to keep the lifeblood of civilization flowing in one direction only: away. The first genius of his design lay in its simplicity. He didn't invent sanitation, he organised it. Bazalgette realised that London's chaos of random drains and cesspits needed something the Victorians rarely had: coordination. Instead of dozens of small systems choking on each other's waste, he planned a single vast network, elegant, logical, unstoppable. The city would be divided into districts, each one feeding into larger interceptor sewers that would collect the flow and carry it east, out of sight and smell. Gravity would do most of the work. It was engineering as philosophy. Let nature pull the handle. Bazalgette's solution was as practical as it was poetic. He didn't rely on pumps or fancy mechanisms. Those could fail. He relied on slope. Every inch of his sewers was calculated so that water and waste would glide smoothly downhill, obeying gravity's eternal sense of duty. It was a design both humble and revolutionary. London's waste, once so eager to linger in cellars and alleys, was now destined for a one-way journey to the Thames estuary. As one wit later remarked, Bazalgette taught London how to let go. And then there was the size. Victorians were known for overdoing things, from beards to banquets, but Bazalgette's excess was purposeful. He built the sewers so big you could drive a carriage through them, though not recommended unless you had a strange hobby. When his critics accused him of the extravagance, he shrugged off their penny-pinching. "We're only going to do this once," he said, "and there's always the unforeseen." That unforeseen turned out to be us, modern Londoners, still using the same tunnels over 150 years later. His foresight was literally built into the bricks. Speaking of bricks, there were millions, over 300 million to be precise, each one laid by hand. The tunnels weren't crude tubes, they were architectural masterpieces, carefully curved to resist pressure and channel flow. Their surfaces gleamed with glazed bricks to minimise build-up and ease cleaning, because nothing ruins a revolution like a clog. The precision was astonishing. Surveyors measured every gradient, every turn, down to fractions of an inch. If the slope was even slightly wrong, waste could stagnate, and stagnation in Victorian London was another word for tragedy. The construction sites themselves were worlds unto their own. Thousands of labourers, known affectionately as navvies, worked day and night with pickaxes and wheelbarrows. Steam cranes hoisted earth from deep shafts. Horses hauled carts laden with bricks. Foremen barked orders through the clamour. In some places they dug so deep that the roar of the city above faded into a faint hum, replaced by the echo of shovels and the drip of groundwater. These men built the underworld, not the mythic one of Dante, but the practical one of drains. Their sweat became the mortar of modernity. Each tunnel was a triumph of geometry. The circular and egg-shaped designs weren't aesthetic choices, they were structural genius. The curved walls resisted collapse while the narrow base increased flow velocity. The sewers self-cleaned as they ran, flushing away sediment before it could settle. In other words, Bazalgette had designed a system that practically maintained itself, an engineer's dream and a bureaucrat's miracle. But the sewers didn't exist in isolation. Bazalgette integrated them seamlessly into the city above. When he built the massive embankments along the Thames, the Victoria, Albert and Chelsea, they weren't just pretty riverside promenades. Beneath their elegant facades ran intercepting sewers, gas lines and new roadways. He transformed sanitation into civic beauty. Londoners could stroll along the embankment admiring the view, blissfully unaware that below their polished boots flowed everything they'd rather not think about. It was the ultimate Victorian illusion. Progress hidden beneath grandeur. Every inch of Bazalgette's design spoke to meticulous foresight. He anticipated not just population growth but human folly. He installed overflow systems to handle storms, ventilation shafts to release gases safely, and maintenance tunnels wide enough for workers to walk upright. Nothing was left to chance. Even the outfall pipes that carried waste into the Thames were timed with the tides, releasing effluent when the current flowed away from the city, a polite gesture of engineering etiquette. What's remarkable is how quietly radical it all was. The public saw bricks and pipes. Bazalgette saw the foundation of a new kind of city, one where health and engineering were intertwined. His sewers didn't just carry waste, they carried away fear. For the first time, Londoners could drink, bathe, and breathe without wondering what was lurking beneath their floorboards. Civilization, it turned out, had a drainage plan. And yet Bazalgette's genius wasn't just technical, it was moral. He built with compassion disguised as calculation. His oversized tunnels weren't vanity, they were foresight born of empathy. He understood that cities grow, that people multiply, and that short-sightedness stinks in more ways than one. Where others saw cost, he saw responsibility. When the system was finally complete, it wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was a civic miracle. The stench that had driven Parliament from its chambers vanished. Disease declined. The Thames flowed clean again, its waters no longer the colour of guilt. London had been saved, not by conquest, but by concrete. Bazalgette never boasted about his achievement. He didn't need to. His legacy was invisible by design, humming quietly beneath the cobblestones. And perhaps that's the highest praise an engineer can receive, when no one notices your work because it works perfectly. The Great Stink had done what decades of cholera, reform campaigns and scientific warnings could not. It made the government panic. Parliament had long been immune to the pleas of doctors, engineers and ordinary citizens, but it was defenceless against its own nose. The Thames had become so unbearable that even the most stubborn MP had to admit that something smelled off, quite literally. It wasn't compassion that moved them, as the joke went. It was nostrils. Before the heatwave of 1858, every attempt to reform London's sanitation system had drowned in a swamp of bureaucracy. The government argued endlessly about cost, responsibility, and whether the problem was really that bad. The rich wanted to preserve their taxes, the poor wanted clean water, and the politicians wanted neither responsibility nor blame. For years, reports piled up like so much waste, each more alarmed than the last, each promptly shelved. London could debate filth for eternity, it seemed, but not remove it. Then came that fateful summer, and suddenly money was no longer an abstract topic. The smell was in the corridors of power, wrapping around the carved oak benches of the House of Commons like a physical accusation. Members fled mid-session, coughing into handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar. Parliamentary debates were punctuated by sneezes, gags, and the occasional fainting spell. The Thames, glittering just outside the windows, mocked them with every foul breeze. The government tried quick fixes. Lime was poured into the river by the Nun, producing a fizzing chemical reaction that looked impressive but only succeeded in giving the Thames a new flavour of horror. Others suggested stretching curtains soaked in disinfectant across the windows. One optimistic MP proposed relocating Parliament to Oxford until the air clears. Another suggested building a roof over the river itself, as if Victorian technology could politely smother nature. None of it worked. Finally, Benjamin Disraeli, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, stepped forward. Disraeli was not known for rushing into things. His career was built on style, wit and careful political theatre, but even he recognised that the government could not be seen as the body that choked on its own neglect. He presented a bill to fund a massive overhaul of London's sanitation system, the largest public works project in British history up to that point. Behind the fancy speeches and gentlemanly debates, however, one motive ruled: survival. Disraeli's proposal faced resistance, of course. Parliament, like any institution, could always find a way to turn an emergency into an argument. Some MPs balked at the projected cost, over £3 million, a staggering sum at the time, roughly £400 million today. Why, one member fumed, should we bankrupt the nation for the sake of bad air? Others fretted about upsetting ratepayers, fearing angry letters from the suburbs. A few, with classic British optimism, claimed the problem would solve itself once the weather turns. The river disagreed. Outside Westminster, the public watched with a mix of disgust and delight. Editorials mocked the politicians who had ignored the problem for decades only to be undone by a hot breeze. Punch magazine published cartoons of MPs wearing nose plugs and gas masks debating through clouds of vapour labelled Thames Ode to Parliament. Ordinary Londoners joked that they finally had something in common with their rulers. They all lived in the same stink. What finally turned debate into decision wasn't eloquence, but endurance. The smell refused to go away. For weeks the heat persisted, intensifying the stench until Parliament's very papers began to curl from the humidity. Clerks fled their desks. Curtains, despite being soaked in disinfectant, oozed a foul residue. Even Queen Victoria, whose royal nose was well protected from such indignities, declared the situation intolerable. When royalty notices your city smells like sin, you act. The bill passed in record time. It was less a vote of progress than one of desperation, a legislative version of holding one's breath. The Metropolitan Board of Works was granted the authority and funds to construct the massive new sewer system under Joseph Bazalgette's supervision. Engineers rejoiced. Taxpayers groaned. Politicians congratulated themselves for what they should have done 20 years earlier. In the grand tradition of politics, the crisis was now someone else's problem, specifically the engineers. Still, credit where it's due, the funding was a turning point. It marked one of the first times in British history that the government treated public health as a matter of national importance rather than personal hygiene. Sanitation had gone from a private inconvenience to a public duty. London, long content to let the poor rot in filth, now saw that disease didn't respect class. When cholera crossed bridges and stench breached Parliament, even the privileged realised they were, quite literally, in the same boat. Of course, approving the money was the easy part. Paying for it was another story. The funds came through loans, collected via local taxes and long-term borrowing. The plan was to repay the cost over decades, a forward-thinking strategy that scandalised those who preferred cheap short-term fixes. Critics warned of financial ruin, calling it a sewer tax upon the innocent. Bazalgette, unbothered, rolled up his sleeves and got to work. In hindsight, the cost was a bargain. For less than a fraction of what the British Empire spent on wars or royal weddings, London bought itself survival. The sewer system prevented countless deaths, improved property values, and even boosted morale. It was a rare example of government spending that literally paid off, in health, in comfort, and in the priceless gift of not living in constant nasal distress. When the project was completed, the same politicians who had once gagged at the river proudly toured the embankments, taking credit for foresight they never had. They gave speeches about the triumph of public spirit and the dawn of modern sanitation. History ever polite, let them enjoy their illusion. The truth was simpler. The Great Stink had forced their hand, and the nation's nose had done what logic never could, so it had opened the treasury. And Sobor, the cost of cleanliness was not just measured in pounds and shillings, it was measured in pride, in politics, and in the reluctant humility of a government that had been outwitted by its own smell. The lesson, though rarely admitted, was eternal. Nothing motivates reform faster than an odour that reaches the voting benches. The plans were drawn, the money approved, and London, poor, putrid London, was ready to trade its filth for the future. All that stood between Joseph Bazalgette's blueprints and a cleaner city was the small matter of actually building the thing. It would take an army of men, a mountain of bricks, and enough courage to face down the worst smells in human history. It was, in every sense, the dirtiest job in the world, a job where one bad smell meant it might be your last. From 1859 onward, London became a city under siege, from below. Construction sites pocked the landscape like open wounds. Deep trenches sliced through streets, bridges sprouted scaffolds, and the air filled with the sounds of hammering, shouting, and the steady rhythm of picks striking earth. Bazalgette's project was monumental in both ambition and scale. 6 major intercepting sewers, 450 miles of subsidiary drains, and over 80 miles of massive brick tunnels. It was less a construction project and more a subterranean empire. The workers who built it were known as navvies, short for navigators, a term originally used for men who dug canals, but by mid-century it meant anyone willing to dig through hell for a wage. They came from all over Britain and Ireland, rough men with rougher hands, hardened by years of backbreaking labour. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in conditions that could turn a theologian into an atheist. Pay was decent by the standards of the day, but it was earned with sweat, blisters, and an occasional brush with mortality. The dangers were many. Floods were a constant threat, especially when digging near the Thames. The river had a nasty habit of reminding men who was boss, bursting through unfinished walls and filling tunnels faster than they could be pumped out. Many a navvy survived cholera, only to drown in the very system designed to prevent it. Then there were the gas pockets, bubbles of methane and hydrogen sulfide lurking in the clay, invisible until they exploded or suffocated an unlucky crew. Underground thunder, they called it. A single spark could turn a day's work into a memorial. And yet, the work went on. Steam engines hauled earth by the ton. Cranes swung loads of bricks and mortar into yawning holes that seemed to descend forever. The smell, according to eyewitnesses, was indescribable, something between a damp grave and a chemical experiment gone wrong. The men adapted the only way humans can, through humour. They joked that if the air didn't kill you, the foreman's shouting might. Some swore they could tell what neighbourhood they were digging under by the flavour of the muck. "Chelsea," one man reportedly said, "smells of perfume and sin." Bazalgette himself was no armchair engineer. He inspected the sites in person, dressed in sturdy boots and a bowler hat that looked far too clean for the surroundings. He spoke politely, took meticulous notes, and occasionally scolded foremen for cutting corners. His standards were legendary. Every brick had to fit perfectly. Every gradient had to match the plans within fractions of an inch. He treated the sewers like cathedrals and his labourers like the apostles of sanitation. Even the navvies, who mocked everyone, respected old Baz for his fairness and grit. The logistics were staggering. The bricks alone, over 300 million of them, had to be fired, transported and laid by hand. Cement came by barge, iron pipes by rail, timber by the mile. Supply chains stretched across the empire. There were moments when the entire project seemed on the verge of collapse, not from incompetence but sheer exhaustion. Rain turned work sites into swamps. Cold froze mortar solid. And through it all, the smell never left. Yet amid the filth and chaos, there was an undeniable rhythm to the work, a kind of underground music made of clanks, shovels, and shouted orders. Whole neighbourhoods watched the project like a slow-motion miracle. Children pressed their faces to the fences to see the giant pipes being lowered into the earth. To them, it must have looked like London was sprouting a secret second city below the first, one made not of marble and glass, but of brick and sweat. When the first major section was completed, the western main drain, the sense of triumph was palpable. It was a tunnel large enough for a man on horseback to ride through, though no one dared try. Workers lit lanterns along the curved walls, their glow reflecting off the damp brick like stained glass. For a moment, the navvies saw their creation not as a sewer, but as something almost holy. One journalist described it as a cathedral to cleanliness. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Salvation, it seemed, could come from the smell of sulphur and the sound of hammers. There were smaller victories too. The embankments rose, the riverbank stabilised, and the city began to look more civilised, even above ground. As the tunnels connected and the system came alive, something remarkable happened. The stench began to fade. Slowly, imperceptibly, the air cleared. The Thames no longer looked like broth. People could dine near the river without fainting. The newspapers, once full of despair, began printing cautious praise. London was becoming livable. By the time the last brick was laid in 1865, the monster sewers had become a legend. The project had employed tens of thousands, consumed mountains of material and transformed the very bones of the city. Bazalgette's system didn't just move waste, it moved history. For the first time, a modern city had tamed its own pollution. When the workers packed up their tools, the streets above seemed unchanged. But beneath their feet lay one of the greatest engineering feats of the century, a hidden masterpiece humming quietly in the dark. The navvies had gone home, the danger had passed, and the smell was, finally, someone else's problem. By the mid-1860s, London was a city transformed, though most of that transformation was buried out of sight. Beneath its cobblestone ran Bazalgette's massive sewers, channeling away the waste that had once terrorised the Thames. But Victorians, never content with function alone, decided that if they were going to dig up half the city to hide their filth, they might as well make it look beautiful. Thus began one of the most ambitious urban facelifts in history, the Thames Embankment Project, a masterclass in how to disguise a sewer system as architecture. Victorians managed to hide their mess elegantly, like putting lace over a landfill. Before the makeover, the river's edge was a chaotic mess. The Thames slopped against muddy banks cluttered with barges, rotting timber, and the occasional unfortunate animal. Streets ended abruptly in swamps of black sludge, and the smell could knock the optimism out of a hymn. The river was both the city's artery and its shame, wide, brown, and unashamedly alive with things that shouldn't be. At low tide, Londoners could watch the city's sins steaming in the sun. Bazalgette saw something else, potential. His great sewers needed a home, long, stable ground near the river where gravity could do its work. And so he conceived the Thames Embankment, a grand series of raised riverfront terraces that would hide the sewers below while giving London the gift of order, elegance, and space. It was, in effect, a massive public relations project for waste management. The same system that had once made Londoners gag would now make them promenade. The design was as audacious as it was practical. The embankments, the Victoria, Albert and Chelsea, were not mere walls, but multi-layered marvels. Inside their granite facades ran three systems: sewers at the lowest level, gas and water mains above them, and finally new roadways and walkways for the public. Above flowed carriages and afternoon strollers. Below, the hidden river of everything London wanted to forget. It was urban duality at its finest, the polite world atop, the impolite one humming beneath. Building it was a colossal effort. The Victorian embankment alone required reclaiming 37 acres from the Thames, as if London had decided to build itself a front porch. Piles were driven deep into the riverbed, and thousands of tons of stone were hauled in from quarries across the country. Cranes groaned, barges lined up like floating warehouses, and the city's skyline filled with scaffolding. The project was as noisy as it was noble. Shopkeepers cursed the disruption, poets romanticised it, and small boys treated it as the century's best free show. Bazalgette's engineers weren't just building walls, they were reshaping geography. The embankments narrowed the river, forcing the current to flow faster and flush itself naturally. A brilliant bit of hydrological sleight of hand. The once sluggish Thames began to move like a proper river again, not a lazy soup. By containing the river within granite borders, Bazalgette gave London a cleaner edge, literally and symbolically. It was civic hygiene turned into sculpture. When the first sections opened to the public in 1868, the transformation was astonishing. The muddy, malodorous banks were gone, replaced by wide boulevards lined with gas lamps, benches, and freshly planted trees. Pedestrians strolled in their Sunday best, marvelling at the strange luxury of walking beside a river that no longer smelled like sin. Couples picnicked where once dead pigs had floated. The upper class, previously too refined to approach the Thames, began to see it as a destination rather than a warning. The embankments quickly became symbols of progress. They weren't just infrastructure, they were civic pride materialised in stone. The Victorian imagination adored symmetry and order, and here was both on display, the untamed river domesticated, the chaos of the city tidied into a postcard. Newspapers gushed about the beauty of sanitation, a phrase no one had dared utter before. Even Queen Victoria herself took a ceremonial drive along the new road, waving graciously to the invisible army of engineers entombed beneath her wheels. Above ground, the embankments became fashionable promenades. Artists painted them, lovers met upon them, and children played along their clean, well-kept paths. Below ground, however, the system remained as heroic and grim as ever, the unseen empire of brick tunnels tirelessly swallowing London's waste. It was the perfect Victorian compromise. Morality and modernity held hands, pretending not to notice what the other was doing. And of course, no Victorian achievement would be complete without some decorative excess. The embankments were adorned with elegant balustrades, bronze lamps, and stone lions that doubled as flood outlets, each lion's mouth carved open to let water escape during heavy tides. These creatures became silent sentinels of the river, noble and unamused, forever watching the city parade past. Londoners grew fond of them, inventing the rhyme, "When the lions drink, London will sink. When they're up to their mains, we'll go down the drains." It was civic poetry, equal parts aberration and foreboding. The environmental impact was immediate. The river's tides ran clearer, and fish slowly returned to waters once deemed suicidal. The improvement was so dramatic that some Victorians credited divine favour rather than engineering. "Providence," one preacher declared, "has rewarded our cleanliness." In truth, Providence had nothing to do with it. It was gravity, brickwork, and the relentless precision of one engineer who refused to compromise. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Thames embankment was psychological. It taught Londoners something profound, that ugliness could be redesigned, that filth could be hidden without denying its existence, and that progress could wear a granite face. The city learned to build beauty atop necessity, to cover its problems not just with perfume but with purpose. By the time the final section was completed in the 1870s, London stood prouder, cleaner, and ever so slightly smugger. Visitors marvelled at the transformation. This, one American tourist wrote, is what civilization looks like. He was only half right. Civilization, as Bazalgette knew, was still flowing unseen beneath his feet. The Victorian age prided itself on being the pinnacle of progress. Steam engines, railways, telegraphs, and tea at precisely 4 o'clock. Yet the invention that truly defined civilization didn't run on coal or cables. It ran on water, and it lived humbly in the smallest room of the house. The flush toilet, once a ridiculous curiosity for the rich, was about to make its triumphant, gurgling debut across society. The first toilets were louder than honour and cost as much as a horse, but for Victorians, dignity was finally within reach and conveniently plumbed. Before the flush revolution, most households still relied on chamber pots or backyard privies. A toilet in the 1830s was less a piece of furniture and more an exercise in logistics. Even the wealthy, who had indoor facilities, treated them as accessories rather than necessities, hidden away like embarrassing relatives. The idea of water magically whisking away one's daily sins felt unnatural, almost suspiciously convenient. After all, this was the same society that distrusted railway speed and electric light. Flushing, to the early Victorian mind, seemed almost arrogant. But progress has a way of sneaking in through the plumbing. Early prototypes of flush toilets existed centuries before, the Tudors even dabbled, but it wasn't until the 19th century, with Bazalgette's mighty sewers ready to receive the offering, that they could flourish. Engineers and inventors turned their attention to making sanitation not just practical, but fashionable. And if there was one thing Victorians loved, it was turning private matters into public bragging rights. Enter the golden age of toilet inventors. There was Alexander Cumming, who patented the S-bend in 1775, a simple yet genius curve of pipe that sealed out the stench of the underworld. Then came George Jennings, the plumbing entrepreneur who made the flush fashionable by installing public retiring rooms at the Great Exhibition of 1851. For 1 penny you could relieve yourself in style, complete with mahogany seats, running water and soap. Over 800,000 curious visitors spent a penny that year, coining both a phrase and a new national pastime. And of course there was Thomas Crapper, plumbing's most unfairly celebrated name. Contrary to rumour, he didn't invent the toilet, but he perfected it. His company's showroom in Chelsea was a temple to sanitary modernity. Behind gleaming glass windows stood polished porcelain thrones with brass fittings and elaborate pull chains. It was the Apple store of excretion. Passers-by gawked. Some came just to see the marvels, others left reviews in local papers, praising the quiet dignity of Mr. Crapper's valves. Privacy had become performance. Still, the flush toilet remained a luxury for years. Early models were absurdly expensive, temperamental and prone to violent noises that could frighten guests. Some sounded like cannon fire. One American visitor claimed the noise in a London hotel startled him so that he offered his apologies to the entire building. The mechanics were delicate. Pull too softly and nothing happened. Too firmly and you risked a small indoor Niagara. It took several decades and much embarrassment before the technology became truly reliable. For those who could afford it, however, the flush toilet was a symbol of refinement. Plumbing manuals of the era advised families on proper installation, emphasizing both hygiene and class. The convenience should be discreetly placed, one guide warned, lest conversation drift toward unsavoury topics. Guests were not to mention the contraption at all, though everyone knew who had one and who didn't. Possessing a flush toilet became a quiet badge of modernity, the difference between a household that had arrived and one still living in medieval conditions. As cities grew cleaner and sewers expanded, prices dropped. By the 1870s and 1880s, middle-class homes began installing them in earnest. Mass production made porcelain cheaper, pipes more reliable, and privacy more affordable. Plumbing became part of the architecture, not an afterthought. Builders competed to offer the latest models, some with ornamental woodwork, others with floral patterns on the bowl. because Victorians believed that even the most personal moments deserved decoration. And true to their character, the Victorians made etiquette rules for using the toilet. Manuals instructed that flushing was to be done discreetly, without undue force or ceremony. Water closets were to be kept immaculate, a reflection of moral virtue. Servants were trained to polish handles and lids daily, and God help the maid who allowed limescale to appear. Respectability, it seemed, was now measured in porcelain shine. Of course, not everyone approved. Critics feared that indoor plumbing might blur social hierarchies. If the poor could flush like the rich, what would become of civilization? Moralists warned that such comfort might lead to idleness, while others fretted over the danger of women being tempted to linger in private spaces. Newspapers ran letters debating whether the water closet was a triumph or a threat to decency. One clergyman even called it the mechanization of modesty. But progress proved unstoppable. As hygiene improved, so did health. The spread of toilets drastically reduced the diseases that once haunted the city. No longer did waste flow openly through alleys or soak into wells. The bathroom became not just a place of necessity, but a sanctuary, a symbol of modern control over chaos. In a century obsessed with manners, it was fitting that civilization's crowning achievement involved learning to dispose of its own dirt quietly. By the end of the 19th century, the flush toilet had gone from whispered luxury to unspoken essential. What began as a status symbol became a standard, reshaping both domestic life and urban planning. It changed the rhythm of the household, the design of the home, even the language of daily life. Words like loo, lavatory, and water closet entered polite conversation, or at least polite euphemism. The great irony, of course, was that this triumph of cleanliness depended entirely on what lay unseen. Bazalgette's hidden network of tunnels, the silent arteries that carried away the evidence of progress. The Victorians congratulated themselves for their civility, never quite acknowledging that it all rested on gravity and good brickwork. But that was the essence of the age, to elevate even the most human realities with marble, lace, and denial. In the end, the flush toilet wasn't just an invention. It was a revolution disguised as convenience, a porcelain promise that modern life could be clean, controlled, and quietly elegant. And perhaps, in its own noisy way, it was the most Victorian invention of all. If the Victorians had one weakness, it was their inability to leave well enough alone. Once the flush toilet became a respectable part of polite society, inventors, engineers, and opportunists across Britain descended upon it like a flock of pigeons spotting a fresh loaf of bread. Everyone wanted to improve it, patent it, or make it sing. The result was one of the strangest industrial rivalries in history, the Great Toilet Wars, where innovation met obsession and dignity was occasionally lost down the drain. Yes, Thomas Crapper was real, and no, he didn't invent the word. He just made it famous. It all began in the aftermath of success. Once flush toilets became a fixture in upper middle-class homes, the market exploded. Sanitation had gone from taboo to trend. Entrepreneurs smelled opportunity, and thankfully not much else. Between the 1850s and 1890s, Britain registered hundreds of patents for toilet improvements. Some were brilliant, some bizarre, and others downright dangerous. The Victorians, in their quest for hygiene, had turned the humble act of flushing into a national sport. The battlefield was porcelain and brass, and the warriors wore waistcoats. On one side stood George Jennings, the man who had introduced the public to pay-to-pee luxury at the Great Exhibition of 1851. His monkey closet, a refined mahogany-seated contraption, had revolutionized public sanitation. Jennings was a businessman with flair. He marketed comfort as a moral virtue. His toilets promised not just cleanliness but respectability. His advertisements were practically sermons, decency made convenient. Opposing him, at least in the public imagination, was Thomas Crapper, the man whose name would forever echo through bathrooms worldwide. Born to a poor Yorkshire family, Crapper became an apprentice plumber at 11 and a master craftsman by 20. He was no scientist, but he had the soul of a showman. He opened the world's first luxury plumbing showroom in Chelsea, displaying fully functional flush toilets behind glass windows, an act that scandalised and fascinated Londoners in equal measure. Passers-by could admire the latest in sanitary engineering without embarrassment, though rumours suggest that more than one customer tested the merchandise on the sly. Crapper's genius lay in making plumbing glamorous. He patented dozens of small but vital improvements: the floating ballcock valve, that little device that stops tanks from overflowing, the siphonic flush system, and the corrosion-resistant fittings that made toilets more reliable. His company's motto might as well have been, "Elegance begins below." His royal clients included Edward VII and George V, ensuring that the flush became not only fashionable, but monarchical. Few people could say their business had literally served the crown, but Crapper was far from alone in this porcelain arms race. Across Britain, inventors churned out designs that ranged from clever to catastrophic. John Shanks of Scotland developed his own line of water closets that emphasised mechanical precision. Edward Johns and his company Twyford experimented with shapes and materials, producing toilets so ornate they looked like teacups for giants. The sanitary industry had found its aesthetic era, a time when engineers competed not just to make toilets work better, but to make them beautiful. And then there were the eccentrics. One inventor proposed a pneumatic evacuator, a device that used air pressure to blast waste directly into nearby drains, the only problem being that sometimes it blasted back. Another designed a dual-bowl contraption to separate liquid and solid matters, with all the dignity of a laboratory experiment gone wrong. A third proudly unveiled a musical commode that played chimes after each flush, presumably to distract from the acoustics of nature. The patent office must have smelled of ambition and desperation. Advertisements for these new contraptions filled Victorian newspapers. Each company claimed superiority, the silent flush of the future, the hygienic wonder of the age, the closet fit for a queen. Middle-class households eager to keep up with the Joneses, or perhaps the Crappers, eagerly purchased new models as often as they changed wallpaper. Plumbing became the new fashion frontier. One could measure a gentleman's status not by his dinnerware but by his drainpipe. But progress, as always, came with mishaps. Early versions of high-pressure flush systems sometimes misfired, spraying unsuspecting users in the worst possible ways. Faulty seals turned elegant bathrooms into splash zones. Public restrooms occasionally flooded when multiple toilets flushed at once, leading to what the press dubbed hydraulic pandemonium. One scandalised lady reportedly fainted after witnessing a violent ejection in a hotel lavatory, and a hapless inventor was said to have declared bankruptcy after a demonstration went disastrously wrong. The audience fled before he could finish explaining the self-regulating valve. Despite the chaos, the toilet wars advanced public hygiene faster than any government decree could have. Competition forced companies to improve efficiency, reduce water usage and refine sanitation design. Flush handles became smoother, traps became safer, and tanks became quieter. The noise that once startled guests into repentance evolved into a soft, civilized rush, the sound of modernity itself. Meanwhile, across the channel, French inventors joined the fray with their own flair. They introduced bidets, which the British found horrifyingly un-English. Continental habits, sneered one London columnist, should remain on the continent. The British preferred their plumbing to be functional, not philosophical. And so while Europe experimented with personal hygiene, Britain perfected the art of dignified disposal. By the end of the 19th century, the toilet wars had created an empire of porcelain. Entire towns hosted factories dedicated to producing basins, tanks, and pipes. Trade journals debated symphonic flow dynamics the way poets debated sonnets. Sanitation had become science and plumbing had become art. Even etiquette evolved. Never speak of it, but always have the best one. Thomas Crapper, who retired a wealthy man, probably never imagined his name would outlive the queen he served. Yet it did. American soldiers in World War I saw Crapper and Co. engraved on British toilets and began using crapper as slang, a linguistic souvenir that cemented his immortality. He didn't invent the toilet, but in a way, he invented how we think about it, as something both essential and ordinary, revolutionary and routine, and that perhaps was the true end of the toilet wars. Out of rivalry came reliability. Out of vanity came hygiene. The Victorian obsession with progress, once mocked, had turned one of life's least glamorous necessities into an enduring symbol of civilization. The age of invention had flushed away embarrassment and replaced it with porcelain polished, perfected, and always ready for the next great idea. The year was 1851, and London was preparing to show off. The Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace promised a spectacle of modern genius. Steam engines, sewing machines, diamonds, and dreams. But among the glittering inventions and moral speeches, one unexpected marvel quietly stole the show: the world's first modern public toilet. It was the unsung masterpiece of the exhibition, and unlike the crown jewels, you could use it for only 1 penny. Finally, relief for the bladder, but not the wallet. The mastermind was George Jennings, already a celebrated plumber-inventor with a flair for marketing. He understood something profound about the human condition. You can invent locomotives and telegraphs all you like, but everyone, eventually, just needs a decent place to go. He installed his monkey closets, an elegant row of mahogany-seated, flushable toilets with running water, soap and towels, in a discreet corner of the exhibition grounds. Each visitor paid a penny for admission, which covered both the facilities and a towel to dry one's hands. The result was nothing short of a revelation. 800,000 visitors spent a penny during that summer, generating not only revenue but an entirely new phrase for British life. Suddenly, relieving oneself became a matter of public economics. The penny fee, affordable yet respectable, transformed necessity into novelty. Newspapers praised the civilized convenience. Critics, ever vigilant, grumbled that it was indecent to charge for such a natural act, but they still lined up when the need arose. Jennings had tapped into something truly Victorian, the perfect marriage of morality, mechanics, and money. Before this, London's options were limited and unpleasant. The poor made do with alleyways, chamber pots, or the riverbank if they were feeling scenic. Gentlemen of means could sometimes sneak into taverns, while ladies were expected to display the bladder control of saints. For women in particular, the lack of facilities dictated behaviour. Entire social outings were planned around the question of proximity to home. When Jennings opened his polished public lavatories, it wasn't just sanitation, it was liberation, albeit with gender restrictions. His exhibition toilets were for men only. Victorian equality, as usual, stopped at the door. After the exhibition, the penny-paying model caught on. By the 1860s, public conveniences began sprouting across London like civic mushrooms, marble, tiled and discreetly tucked into railway stations, parks, and city squares. They were often underground, accessible via wrought-iron staircases adorned with lamps and railings so ornate that some pedestrians mistook them for art installations. Below ground, attendants in crisp uniforms kept everything spotless, polishing brass handles until they gleamed like minor deities of hygiene. The Victorians turned even past urination into ceremony. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists feared that public toilets would encourage unseemly congregations and lascivious lingering. Newspapers fretted about who might meet whom in such enclosed spaces. Women's advocates, on the other hand, protested that the absence of facilities for ladies was effectively imprisoning them indoors. The debate over the urinary divide became an unlikely battlefield for early feminism. Pamphlets argued passionately that women too possess bladders, though society prefers to forget it. By the 1880s, after decades of pressure, London grudgingly opened its first female public convenience near Oxford Circus, delicate in decor, discreet in signage, and twice the price of the men's. Progress apparently had a surcharge. The architecture of these facilities reflected the national psyche. The exteriors whispered respectability, while the interiors hummed with tiles, mirrors, and the faint aroma of carbolic soap. Many were built in the same ornate style as churches or opera houses, complete with mosaic floors and polished marble basins. The Victorians couldn't simply build a toilet, they had to build a temple to restraint. Rules were posted everywhere: no spitting, no smoking, and in some cases, no loitering beyond 5 minutes. The message was clear: efficiency, not comfort. Public convenience attendants became minor urban celebrities. Known colloquially as loo-men, they took fierce pride in their stations, greeting visitors with the gravity of diplomats. Their duties included cleaning, collecting pennies, and ensuring order among the patrons, a delicate task when your clientele ranged from dukes to drunks. Some attendants supplemented their wages with tips, others with gossip. It was said that the loos of London knew more secrets than the newspapers ever dared print. Economically, the penny toilet business thrived. Municipalities discovered that sanitation could pay for itself. The revenues funded maintenance, wages, and expansion. By the 1890s, the city boasted hundreds of public conveniences, each one a tiny victory for hygiene and civic pride. Tourists marvelled at their efficiency. American visitors wrote home in awe that even the facilities are punctual. In true British fashion, the empire that spanned the globe was now exporting not just railways and bureaucracy, but the concept of paying to pee. Yet the penny system also became a subtle class marker. The very existence of public toilets signalled mobility, that people were out, working, socialising, existing beyond the domestic sphere. For the working poor, they were essential. For the middle class, they were reassurance. For the upper class, they were largely irrelevant. Unless, of course, one found oneself caught short between tea appointments. Then social hierarchy bowed to biology. Nothing humbles an aristocrat faster than a locked lavatory door and a missing penny. Humour predictably flowed. Music hall comedians found endless inspiration in the penny palace. Jokes abounded about long queues, sticky pennies, and the panic of realising you'd spent your last coin on a newspaper. The phrase "spend a penny" entered the national vocabulary, a genteel euphemism that allowed Victorians to discuss the unspeakable without soiling conversation. It remains one of Britain's most enduring linguistic relics, a reminder that even bodily functions can be domesticated with the right dose of wit. By the dawn of the 20th century, the paper pea revolution had reshaped urban life. Public toilets became as essential to the cityscape as street lamps or postboxes. They offered comfort, dignity, and most importantly, a sense of order. London had learned that civilization wasn't measured by cathedrals or palaces, but by the availability of clean, well-maintained loos. George Jennings didn't live to see the full impact of his invention, but his legacy endures every time someone fumbles for change outside a public restroom. The penny charge may have begun as a novelty, but it became an institution, a perfect Victorian compromise between practicality and profit. You could now walk the streets of London with confidence, knowing that when nature called, civilization would answer, for a small fee. Progress, as the Victorians discovered, had a sense of humour and a slightly homicidal streak. For every shining sewer and polished porcelain throne, there were also geysers of disaster waiting to happen behind closed doors. Early plumbing, though revolutionary, was still a wild experiment in water, pressure, and human optimism. The result? A city where every flush came with suspense. In Victorian bathrooms, sanitation was half comfort, half Russian roulette. Imagine dying on the toilet and becoming an urban legend, Victorian style. The problem began where all good intentions do, with confidence. Once the new flush toilets spread across London, the public assumed that modern plumbing had conquered every possible peril. After all, Joseph Bazalgette's mighty sewers had tamed the Thames. What could possibly go wrong inside one's own home? Quite a lot, as it turned out. For all their elegance, Victorian bathrooms were ticking time bombs of gas, leaks, and poor design. The culprit was methane, the ghost of excrement past. Beneath London, millions of gallons of sewage bubbled quietly, producing gases that seeped upward through ill-fitted pipes. Without proper vents, pressure built up in water closets like invisible dynamite. One unlucky spark, one candle placed too close, and the polite act of washing up could turn into a minor explosion. Newspapers occasionally carried grisly reports of sanitary accidents, a polite euphemism for someone who had just learned, quite literally, that plumbing could blow up in your face. There were tales, some apocryphal, others disturbingly well documented, of toilets launching lids skyward like cannonballs. In one infamous incident from the 1880s, a lady of respectable means lit a match to mask an odour and instead ignited her entire lavatory. The blast was reportedly heard 2 streets away, and the incident became the talk of every dinner table that evening. A terrible case of domestic combustion, remarked one newspaper. Victorians loved progress, but not when it turned their bathrooms into battlefields. Gas wasn't the only hazard. Early pipes, made of lead and poorly sealed iron, leaked constantly. Water pressure was inconsistent, meaning that flushing in one home could cause a sudden, terrifying gurgle in another. Guests sitting innocently in a neighbour's parlour might hear an ominous rumble beneath the floorboards, a reminder that the age of progress still had plumbing anxiety. And when winter struck, the chaos multiplied. Pipes froze solid, then burst spectacularly as soon as they thawed, showering hallways in icy water and indignity. Homeowners who once bragged about their modern conveniences suddenly found themselves begging plumbers at midnight. Even when things didn't explode, Victorian plumbing had a flair for the dramatic. Traps, those little water barriers meant to block sewer gases, often failed. One dry spell and the scent of the underworld returned, creeping up through the pipes like a ghost with unfinished business. Families burned incense and scattered carbolic crystals in their bathrooms, hoping to exorcise whatever demon had possessed the drain. It didn't help that the decorative wood panelling so beloved by Victorian designers absorbed smells like a sponge, creating an aroma that no amount of lavender water could disguise. Then there were the phantom flushes. Pressure imbalances in upstairs tanks could cause sudden surges of water, leading toilets to flush spontaneously in the dead of night. More than one nervous homeowner reported these events to newspapers as evidence of haunted bathrooms. Ghosts, it seemed, were easier to believe in than bad engineering. Plumbers, meanwhile, became both heroes and villains. They were the frontline troubleshooters of the new sanitary age, essential, expensive, and occasionally drunk. A good plumber could save your house, a bad one could turn it into a lagoon. Their reputation oscillated between miracle workers and thieves, depending on how well the pipes behaved afterward. Plumbing manuals of the era brimmed with advice for householders. Trust no amateur, one warned, lest you invite pestilence and ruin into your home. The wealthy, as usual, suffered in style. Their mansions boasted complex plumbing systems with multiple water closets, baths, and cisterns, all interconnected like the organs of a mechanical beast. Unfortunately, these systems often shared the same vent pipes, which meant that under the right conditions, one ill-timed flush in the servants' quarters could send a fragrant message up through the master's suite. Nothing humbled a duke faster than realising that his marble bathroom was echoing with the consequences of someone else's digestion. Still, the Victorians refused to give up on progress. They tinkered endlessly, adding valves, traps and vents in a desperate effort to outsmart nature. The invention of the U-bend, credited to Alexander Cumming and refined by Thomas Crapper, was hailed as the Great Salvation, a simple curve that trapped water and blocked gases, but even that innovation couldn't save everyone. Without proper maintenance, the bends dried out, the seals cracked, and methane staged a comeback. Even when all went smoothly, the psychological unease remained. Victorians were fascinated by what they couldn't see, the idea that their homes contained invisible networks humming with unseen dangers. The new plumbing systems, with their mysterious pipes and sudden noises, became a symbol of both progress and paranoia. Popular magazines published humorous essays about the haunted lavatory or when the flush fails. Cartoonists depicted bewildered homeowners battling their own bathrooms with mops and shovels. And yet, for all the explosions, leaks and hauntings, plumbing panic gradually gave way to confidence. As technology improved, pipes were better sealed, vents properly installed and materials standardised. By the 1890s, most new homes featured safer designs and separate ventilation shafts, drastically reducing the risk of accidental immolation during one's morning routine. The modern bathroom, serene and functional, was slowly being born out of decades of anxiety and trial. Still, the legends lingered. Tales of exploding toilets became part of London's folklore. Whispered reminders that even the most civilised societies sit precariously atop chaos. The Victorians had conquered cholera, tamed the Thames, and installed marble basins fit for queens, but plumbing had taught them a final humbling truth. You can't out-engineer mischief entirely, because progress, in all its gleaming brass and porcelain glory, still had a tendency to blow up now and then, sometimes literally. In the grand saga of Victorian progress, one group was consistently left crossing its legs: women. The city had gaslights, railways, and flush toilets that could be heard 2 streets away, but half the population still had nowhere to go. While men enjoyed their new penny-paying palaces of relief, women were expected to plan their day around their bladder. The result was a silent crisis that shaped everything from fashion to feminism. After all, feminism began somewhere between a corset and a missing bathroom. To understand the absurdity of this imbalance, imagine a typical day in 1880s London. A gentleman could stroll from club to cafe, never more than a few blocks from a public convenience. He could spend a penny, adjust his hat, and continue about his business with dignity intact. His wife, meanwhile, faced an entirely different calculus. There were no public toilets for her, no discreet facilities tucked behind the bustle of the city. Once she left home, her options narrowed to 0. Trips had to be timed like military operations, a sortie into public life with a retreat scheduled before tea. The absence of facilities wasn't an accident. It was ideology. Victorian society prized female modesty above comfort. The mere idea of a ladies' lavatory was considered scandalous, as if acknowledging that women had bodily needs was an act of indecency. Public toilets were seen as spaces of function, and therefore of men. Women, it was assumed, had the luxury of privacy, because respectable women were always near home. An assumption that crumbled the moment a woman dared to take a train, shop or work for a living. In fact, women's growing visibility in public life, as shoppers, typists, teachers and reformers, collided headlong with the city's masculine design. The new department stores of the 1860s, such as Harrods and Whiteley's, became the first semi-public spaces where women could rest, refresh, and use discreet facilities. But even then, these retiring rooms were not true toilets. They were more like fainting chambers, genteel spaces with couches, mirrors, and the quiet denial that anything biological might happen there. For working-class women, the situation was worse. Factory shifts lasted 10 to 12 hours, with few breaks and even fewer privies. Many women simply abstained from drinking water during the day to avoid embarrassment. Doctors began noticing a rise in bladder infections and kidney ailments among female labourers, the medical cost of modesty. One physician, with commendable understatement, called it a curious form of occupational suffering. It wasn't that no one cared, it was that no one dared. Campaigns for women's sanitary rights faced ridicule. Newspapers mocked early advocates as the ladies of the Lavatory League, suggesting that discussing such topics was more indecent than the problem itself. The National Association for the Advancement of Women's Sanitation, yes, that was a real organisation, held polite meetings filled with euphemisms. Their pamphlets spoke of facilities for refreshment and relief conveniences, as though the word toilette might itself cause fainting. Yet the movement persisted. Feminist reformers argued that true equality required access not just to education or employment, but to basic human dignity. Without facilities, women were effectively confined to the domestic sphere. In 1878, the Social Purity Alliance declared that the freedom of movement for women shall never be complete until she is free to relieve herself without shame or peril. It was a revolutionary statement, one that said, in essence, we'd like to use the city without risking our kidneys. The first real breakthrough came in 1889, when London opened its first public lavatory for women on Bedford Street, Covent Garden. It was small, discreet, and heavily supervised. The entrance was modestly screened, attendants were female, and the decor was determinedly respectable. Floral tiles, wicker furniture, and vases of artificial flowers to remind users that femininity had survived the experience. Still, its opening was greeted with outrage by some moralists, who claimed it would encourage unfeminine wandering. One critic even suggested it might become a meeting place for improper women, though what impropriety could occur near a flush chain was never explained. For many women, the new facility was more than plumbing. It was liberation. They could now spend an entire day in town, attend lectures, or visit exhibitions without plotting escape routes. The convenience of a toilet was, in effect, the convenience of existing. It didn't erase the social barriers, but it weakened one of the most literal ones. The act of using a public lavatory quietly became a feminist statement, a declaration that women had a right to occupy public space, in comfort and on their own terms. Meanwhile, the absurdity of the sanitary gap continued to inspire both activism and humour. Cartoonists lampooned city planners for their urinary oversight, and suffragists sometimes incorporated sanitation into their campaigns. One parody poster read, "Votes for women and somewhere to go afterward." It was funny because it was true. Even Queen Victoria, who reportedly refused to discuss such earthly matters, was rumoured to have commented on the lack of ladies' conveniences during her travels, a royal hint that reform might be overdue. The eventual spread of women's public toilets through the early 20th century was slow, expensive, and always controversial. Each new installation faced protests from those who believed morality would evaporate the moment a woman entered a tiled room without a chaperone. Ironically, the facilities were often funded by female philanthropists, women who used their fortunes to make sure others didn't have to use the bushes. By the time the 1900s rolled around, London finally began to look like a city designed for all its citizens, not just the ones in top hats. The sanitary gap left scars deeper than inconvenience. It shaped urban design, reinforced gender inequality, and quietly dictated who could participate in public life. The right to use a bathroom became absurdly but undeniably part of the fight for women's rights. Every penny lavatory, every tiled corridor was a victory against centuries of social constipation. Looking back, it's astonishing how something so simple, a door, a seat, a lock, could represent so much freedom. The suffragists would later march for the vote, but their revolution had already begun in quieter places, in queues, in whispers, in the polite determination to pee in peace. By the late Victorian era, London had flushed its way into modernity. Sewers rumbled invisibly beneath the streets, public conveniences gleamed like temples of progress, and polished porcelain thrones reigned supreme in bathrooms across the city. Yet, in countless bedrooms, tucked quietly beneath embroidered coverlets and mahogany bedsteads, lurked an old companion of less glamorous times, the chamber pot. The faithful relic of centuries past refused to retire gracefully. Old habits die hard, especially if they're porcelain. For generations, the chamber pot had been as essential as a pillow. It was civilization's first answer to midnight emergencies, rainstorms, and its unheated hallways. In an age before plumbing, venturing outside at night meant braving mud, rats, and the occasional suspicious neighbour. A pot under the bed was the mark of practicality, even luxury. By the 19th century, nearly every household, rich or poor, had one. Some were plain and utilitarian. Others were decorated with floral patterns, gilded rims, or even portraits of politicians, a subtle expression of opinion if ever there was one. The arrival of the flush toilet should have spelled the end of this venerable vessel, but Victorians were nothing if not sentimental and cautious. Not everyone trusted this newfangled contraption that roared, gurgled, and occasionally exploded. The chamber pot, by contrast, was familiar, silent, and in its own humble way, reliable. Many households kept both, the proud new water closet for daytime show, and the trusty old pot for nighttime insurance. It was like owning a carriage and still keeping a donkey, just in case. For rural families and the urban poor, the chamber pot's survival was less about nostalgia and more about necessity. Many homes still lacked indoor plumbing well into the 1880s and 1890s. Tenements relied on shared outdoor privies, which, in winter, froze solid and, in summer, tested the limits of human endurance. The chamber pot remained the pragmatic solution, especially for the elderly, children, or anyone unwilling to queue at midnight with a candle and courage. Yet even among the wealthy, the pot endured as a discreet convenience. Aristocratic bedrooms often featured beautifully crafted night commodes, wooden cabinets that cleverly disguised their purpose. Some resembled side tables or upholstered stools, proving that Victorian design could make even defecation fashionable. Servants, of course, bore the burden of cleaning them. Morning chamber pot duty was one of the least envied tasks in domestic service. Imagine starting your day by balancing a sloshing porcelain bowl through a maze of corridors, praying that gravity and dignity would both hold. Etiquette manuals, ever the guardians of propriety, pretended the chamber pot didn't exist. One guide advised houseguests, upon retiring, make all necessary arrangements for comfort before the maid extinguishes the candle. A genteel way of saying use the pot now, and please don't discuss it later. The less said about such matters, the better. Victorian conversation could dissect art, empire, and existentialism, but the topic of what hid under the bed was as taboo as public nudity. Still, humour found a way to bubble through. The chamber pot became a favourite subject for music hall comedians, who delighted in mocking the prudishness of their betters. Jokes about midnight mishaps, tripping over one, mistaking it for a footbath, or discovering it already occupied, became staples of working-class entertainment. In an era obsessed with decorum, laughter was the only socially acceptable release valve. As plumbing spread and flush toilets became more reliable, the chamber pot began its slow retreat into history. Some families rebranded them as nursery aids, or invalid conveniences. But everyone knew what they were. By the turn of the century, they were fading from respectable homes, consigned to attics, charity shops, and the collective embarrassment of memory. Yet even as they disappeared, they lingered in jokes, superstitions, and the occasional awkward discovery when clearing out a grandparent's house. Not all pots went quietly. Some were repurposed into plant holders, wash basins, or even decorative curiosities. Collectors began to cherish them as quaint relics of a bygone age. Museums proudly displayed 18th and 19th century examples, describing them with the reverence usually reserved for fine china. A porcelain night vessel, circa 1820, one label might read, as if the object hadn't spent its career doing exactly what the museum's patrons now politely refuse to imagine. But the chamber pot's real legacy was psychological. It embodied an intimacy with daily life that modern plumbing have raised. Using one required acceptance of smell, of sound, of the simple fact of being human. The Victorians, for all their prudery, lived closer to those realities than their descendants. There was no lever to separate the act from the evidence, no gurgle of water to make it vanish. The pot demanded acknowledgement, a brief confrontation with mortality, or at least with Monday's breakfast. Even so, the end was inevitable. As indoor plumbing reached the middle and working classes, chamber pots became symbols of backwardness. To own one was to admit defeat in the war for progress. Servants rejoiced as the dreaded morning rounds disappeared from their duties. Children of the new century grew up without ever seeing one, except in jokes or attic relics. And thus, the pot that had faithfully served humanity for millennia slipped quietly out of use, uncelebrated, unthanked, but never truly forgotten. Today, the chamber pot survives mostly as a curiosity, a reminder that comfort is a modern invention and that civilization once depended on porcelain courage under the bed. Antique dealers sell them for far more than they ever cost new, often to buyers who have no idea what they were used for. There's something poetic about that. A final act of Victorian modesty, the pot reclaiming its dignity by masquerading as decoration. In its way, the chamber pot was the great equalizer. Kings, paupers, poets and clerks all met it at eye level, in the dark, hoping not to miss. It may not have been glamorous, but it was honest. And if progress means never needing to think about it again, perhaps we owe that humble bowl more gratitude than history has given it. By the late 19th century, London's relationship with its waste had undergone the full Victorian transformation. From denial to design, from chaos to control, and now inevitably to curiosity. Once upon a time, sewage had been the city's shame, its murky, bubbling secret. Now, it was becoming a subject of fascination. What had once been dumped into rivers was now examined under microscopes. The Victorians went from dumping it to studying it, true academic progress. In the beginning, no one wanted to know what was in sewage. It was bad enough smelling it, let alone cataloguing it. But the rise of public health science, and a few very brave scientists, changed that. After decades of blaming miasma for disease, doctors and engineers finally began to suspect that something far smaller and more sinister was at work. Germs, not odours, carried illness. And where could one find more germs per cubic inch than in the city's sewers? The answer lay in the sludge. Cue the arrival of an entirely new breed of hero, the sanitary scientist. These were not genteel scholars in waistcoats and wigs, but adventurous men armed with test tubes, waders, and questionable life insurance. They descended into tunnels and treatment tanks to collect samples of the stuff civilization left behind. To them, sewage was not filth, it was data. Every droplet was a liquid diary of a city's diet, habits, and health. Among the first to peer into the abyss was Sir Edwin Chadwick, a social reformer turned sanitation crusader. Though more bureaucrat than biologist, Chadwick insisted that waste could be usefully employed. He advocated treating sewage as a resource, an early vision of recycling, albeit with a smell. Meanwhile, scientists like John Snow, who had already linked cholera to contaminated water, paved the way for others to study sewage not as a curse, but as a clue. By the 1870s, sewer science had become a legitimate field of study, attracting engineers, chemists, and the occasional unfortunate assistant. Laboratories began analysing the chemical composition of waste, ammonia, nitrates, phosphates, to understand its potential for fertiliser. The idea was both practical and poetic, turn the city's waste into the countryside's nourishment. London, one researcher quipped, produces more manure than wisdom. We might as well use one to grow the other. This line of thinking led to the first sewage farms, experimental plots where wastewater was filtered through soil and crops grown on the nutrients. The concept horrified the public at first. The idea of lettuce grown on London's leavings didn't inspire confidence. Newspapers joked that salads might now be seasoned with civic spirit. Yet to the scientists' credit, the system worked. The soil purified the liquid, the plants thrived and the rivers grew cleaner. It was messy, but it was progress. Chemical engineers soon joined the fray. They studied how to accelerate decomposition, neutralize pathogens, and extract useful byproducts from sludge. Out of this unglamorous research came remarkable innovations. Biological filtration systems, chemical disinfectants, and the early understanding of microbial ecosystems. For the first time, humanity was not merely running from its own waste, it was learning from it. And then came the microscopes. Victorian laboratories, already obsessed with classification, turned their lenses on sewage samples. What they found was both horrifying and mesmerising, a microscopic jungle teeming with bacteria, protozoa, and mysterious squiggling shapes. These were the unseen citizens of the underworld, transforming rot into renewal. To most people, they were invisible villains. To the sewer scientists, they were the unsung janitors of nature. Studying them became an obsession. London's laboratories filled with jars labelled effluent A and sludge B, each containing a petri dish of plight nightmares. The field advanced rapidly. By the 1880s, research into sewage bacteria had birthed the concept of biological treatment, the idea that microbes could purify water naturally. Scientists discovered that when waste was aerated, bacteria digested the organic matter, leaving behind cleaner water. It was the biological equivalent of setting a monster to eat other monsters. This realization laid the groundwork for modern wastewater treatment, but in its early days, it was just one more example of Victorian ingenuity wrapped in faint horror. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Public lectures on sewer science were notorious for clearing rooms. Even the bravest academics struggled to make audiences care about activated sludge. But the pioneers persevered, arguing that this was the very heart of civilization. "Show me your sewers," declared one sanitation reformer, "and I shall show you your civilization." It was less a boast than a warning. Progress was measurable not by monuments, but by drains. The British weren't alone in this odorous enlightenment. Across Europe and America, cities began hiring chemists and bacteriologists to manage sanitation systems scientifically. Paris, Berlin, and New York established sewage research stations, each racing to outdo the others in purity and efficiency. International conferences were held, discreetly, where delegates debated sludge viscosity and bacterial efficiency over luncheon, pretending the irony wasn't lethal. Out of these unglamorous gatherings emerged the world's first wastewater laboratories, where white-coated technicians treated excrement with the same reverence given to electricity or medicine. It was the dawn of environmental science before anyone had the vocabulary for it. For the Victorians, the idea that the filthiest thing on earth could yield knowledge was deeply satisfying, proof that even dirt could be redeemed by reason. By the 1890s, the scientific approach to sewage had revolutionised both engineering and public health. London's rivers began to recover, disease outbreaks declined, and sanitation became synonymous with civilization. Sewer science had turned what was once the symbol of urban decay into a source of pride, a triumph of the intellect over instinct. And yet, the irony lingered. The same society that fainted at the mention of toilets now funded laboratories dedicated to studying them. Respectable gentlemen who wouldn't say lavatory in public wrote dissertations on fecal bacteria. It was the ultimate Victorian paradox: repression above ground, revolution below. But if the Victorians had mastered anything, it was turning embarrassment into enlightenment. In plumbing, as in science, they proved that progress sometimes begins at the bottom. When Britain discovered the magic of plumbing, it didn't just change its own streets, it changed the world. By the late 19th century, the empire that had once conquered with cannons now conquered with sewers. Nothing exported faster than good plumbing and bad manners. From the boulevards of Paris to the crowded lanes of Bombay, London's Great Flush had become the model for civilization itself. It wasn't just the sun that never set on the British Empire, it was also the smell that finally began to fade. The transformation had begun at home, but the Victorians were far too proud to keep it to themselves. Sanitation was no longer a domestic issue. It was a matter of imperial prestige. To rule the world, one must first deodorize it. The British believed that cleanliness was not merely next to godliness, it was next to Britishness. Cities that aspired to be modern had to prove it by installing proper drainage, tidy water closets, and municipal sewers that ran, ideally, as smoothly as Queen Victoria's moral code. And so the gospel of good plumbing spread outward, carried by engineers, missionaries, and bureaucrats who saw drains as destiny. London had become the shining example, and quite literally the cleanest dirty city on earth. Visitors marvelled at its embankments, its odourless streets, its its mysterious underground network that swallowed filth without complaint. Foreign dignitaries toured the sewers the way others toured cathedrals. One French visitor in 1868 declared, with a mix of awe and envy, "Les Anglais ont domestiqué leurs égouts." The English have domesticated their sewers. It was both compliment and warning. Paris, for its part, refused to be outdone. Napoleon III, determined to make his city the jewel of Europe, unleashed Baron Haussmann to carve grand boulevards and an equally grand sewer system beneath them. Inspired by London's example, and determined to surpass it, Paris built an underground empire of tunnels so clean and vast that the French proudly offered guided tours. Visitors could float through on boats, admiring the engineering while trying not to think too hard about the contents of the water. The Parisians had turned waste management into an art form, complete with chandeliers and signage. Leave it to France to make sewers romantic. Across the Channel, cities scrambled to follow suit. Berlin introduced its own centralised sewer network, New York began purifying its water supply, and even the Ottoman Empire sent envoys to study London's sanitary triumphs. Newspapers around the world hailed the British system as the standard of urban health. In a century obsessed with empire, exporting the flush became as important as exporting railways, law and tea. Civilization, it seemed, flowed through pipes. Nowhere was this influence felt more dramatically than in the colonies. British administrators brought not only soldiers and surveyors, but also sanitary inspectors. They arrived with clipboards and blueprints determined to improve the hygiene of the local population, often without asking whether the locals had requested such improvement. In Calcutta, Bombay and Singapore, engineers laid down sewer grids modelled after London's. The logic was simple. A proper empire required proper plumbing. Never mind that tropical climates, local materials, and cultural habits often made these imported systems less effective than intended. What mattered was the symbolism. Drains as proof of discipline, order, and control. In India, sanitation became both a tool and a metaphor for colonial rule. British officials fretted endlessly about native cleanliness, while presiding over cities where open drains still ran beside palaces. The Raj established sanitary boards and drainage departments that issued reports with the same passion others reserved for poetry. Manuals instructed that civilization begins where effluent ends, and British engineers, sweating under foreign suns, built drains through neighbourhoods that had managed for centuries without them. When locals objected to the disruptions, officials called it resistance to hygiene. Progress, it seemed, was non-negotiable. Back in London, newspapers celebrated these overseas efforts as proof of Britain's benevolent influence. The light of sanitation, one editorial proclaimed, now shines from the Ganges to the Cape. Never mind that the light occasionally flooded, malfunctioned or exploded. The point was moral victory. Sanitation had become imperial propaganda, a physical expression of the belief that the British weren't just ruling the world, they were cleaning it. To be fair, the global sanitation revolution did bring genuine benefits. Epidemics of cholera and typhoid declined wherever modern sewers were installed. Cities that had once stank like open graves began to breathe again. Engineers in Tokyo, Melbourne and Buenos Aires adapted British designs to their own needs, laying the foundations of modern public health worldwide. The age of the sewer scientist had become the age of the sanitary missionary. But beneath the triumphal rhetoric lay cultural absurdity. The Victorians' obsession with flushing everything in sight led to odd encounters between empire and etiquette. Colonial records describe local populations puzzled by the British insistence on sitting rather than squatting, using vast quantities of water, and treating waste disposal as a moral performance. In one account from Ceylon, a British officer proudly demonstrated his new throne of civilization to a group of locals, only for it to clog immediately, earning laughter rather than reverence. Progress, as usual, depended on the plumbing behaving itself. Meanwhile, Britain continued to export not just its pipes, but its pride. Engineers trained under Bazalgette's successors were dispatched to design drainage systems in far-flung cities. Manuals like the Sanitary Engineer's Handbook became as ubiquitous as Bibles. The Empire's civilizing mission, once draped in red coats, now arrived in blueprints and lead fittings. If the Victorians had one motto, it was this: where the Union Jack flies. The sewage flows in the correct direction. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British system had become the global standard. Even America, ever eager to rebel against its former ruler, quietly adopted London's engineering principles for its own cities. The world had heard the flush, and there was no going back. Looking back, it's hard not to admire the audacity. The same people who once bathed once a week were now reshaping continents in the name of cleanliness. They believed that sanitation equaled civilization, that good plumbing could uplift entire societies. In their zeal, they were sometimes right, often wrong, but always certain. And thus, the story of empire was not only written in ink and blood, but in brick and sewage. The flush that began in London's drawing rooms echoed through palaces and ports around the world. It was, in its way, the sound of modernity, the unmistakable gurgle of progress, propriety, and the peculiar British gift for turning even plumbing into policy. While Londoners strolled along the gleaming embankments and admired their reflection in a now clean Thames, another army toiled unseen beneath their feet, the sewer workers. These were the modern descendants of Bazalgette's labourers, the quiet custodians of the underground arteries that kept the city alive. They were the last line of defence between civilization and chaos, and though their job had become safer over the years, it was still one where courage, claustrophobia, and questionable smells were daily companions. Still not glamorous, but at least now they get helmets and respect. After the triumph of Bazalgette's system in the 1860s, the sewers didn't simply run themselves. Gravity may have done most of the work, but gravity doesn't patch leaks, remove blockages, or retrieve lost umbrellas that somehow find their way into drains. Maintaining London's subterranean network required a small army of men, flushers, cleaners, and inspectors who descended into the tunnels armed with shovels, lanterns, and a collective sense of humour strong enough to survive anything. These early sewer workers were practical heroes of the industrial age. They operated in a world of darkness, knee-deep in effluent, where the air was thick enough to chew. Their tools were simple, long-handled scoops, picks, and leather buckets for hauling away sediment that had settled like silt on the riverbed. Sometimes, when the blockage was severe, they went in with nothing more than a rope around the waist and a prayer that the gas levels wouldn't make that rope necessary. Victorian job descriptions were short, but this one could have read, "must not faint easily." Even with Bazalgette's brilliant design, debris found creative ways to accumulate. Sand, soot, rags, horse manure, and even dead animals all conspired to slow the flow. The men called these piles tide traps, and clearing them was equal parts skill and hazard. Before ventilation systems were improved, many workers carried canaries in cages, not for companionship, but as primitive gas detectors. If the bird fell silent, it was time to leave. Their greatest enemy, however, was fire damp, the methane pockets that lingered like ghosts in low-lying tunnels. One spark could turn the underworld into a furnace. Some teams used long poles with candles on the end, lighting the gas in controlled bursts before entering. It was a strange ritual, part science, part pyromania, where success was measured by the absence of funerals. Victorian safety regulations, in other words, were mostly superstition and luck. The pay was modest, but the pride was immense. Sewer workers saw themselves as protectors of the city, guardians of a system that few understood but everyone depended on. They developed their own slang, superstitions, and gallows humour. A typical exchange might include phrases like, "she's running slow tonight," referring not to a horse, but to an entire district's waste flow. Outsiders might wrinkle their noses, but among themselves, sewermen spoke of the line with something approaching affection. Over time, technology caught up with courage. By the early 20th century, electric lights replaced oil lamps, rubberized waders replaced patched leather, and the first mechanical dredgers began doing the dirtiest work. Pumps and ventilation fans transformed the tunnels from death traps into workplaces, still miserable but less lethal. Inspectors with clipboards began making regular rounds, ensuring the sewers stayed clear of obstructions. Rats, the unofficial citizens of the cistern, were both enemies and mascots, tolerated unless they got too bold. During both world wars, the sewers took on unexpected importance. They served as emergency shelters during air raids and as secret passages for civil defence units. Some sections were even used for intelligence operations, the ultimate irony being that the path to national security sometimes ran through what was, quite literally, the nation's waste. The workers maintained the system under blackout conditions, navigating by memory and candlelight. Their work was invisible but invaluable. Modern descendants of Bazalgette's crew still walk those tunnels, though their tools would astonish their predecessors. Cameras mounted on robotic crawlers now inspect the walls for cracks. Sensors monitor gas buildup, pumps and filters hum automatically. Yet despite the machines, human eyes and hands remain essential. Robots can detect a blockage, but they can't scrape it out with stubborn determination or interpret the smell that tells an experienced worker something's wrong upstream. Today's sewer workers wear protective suits, helmets, oxygen packs, and steel-toed boots, gear that would make a 19th century flusher weep with envy. They work in teams, guided by safety protocols and gas detectors, mapping the labyrinth that most Londoners forget exists. And while the city above changes, skyscrapers rising, electric cars whirring past, the tunnels below remain constant, carrying away the evidence of daily life as faithfully as they did in Bazalgette's day. The hazards haven't vanished, only evolved. Flooding still threatens those caught in low sections during heavy rain. Toxic gases remain unpredictable. And then there are the infamous fatbergs, modern monstrosities formed from cooking grease, wipes, and whatever else humanity feels inspired to flush. Removing them requires hydraulic saws, industrial pumps, and a strong stomach. The workers tackle these monsters with the stoicism of soldiers, their victory measured in cubic tons of reclaimed flow. Despite their heroism, these sewer workers rarely make headlines unless something goes catastrophically wrong. Yet every clean street, every running tap, and every unremarkable flush owes its success to their constant vigilance. They are the quiet heirs of Bazalgette's legacy, custodians of civilization's least glamorous miracle. Without them, London would drown in its own success within days. It's easy to forget that progress doesn't maintain itself. For all the triumphs of Victorian engineering, it's the maintenance crews, not the inventors, who keep modern cities functioning. They are proof that the story of sanitation didn't end with the great stink or the grand embankments. It continues daily, shovel by shovel, pipe by pipe. And perhaps that's fitting. The sewers began as monuments to human necessity and became monuments to human endurance. The men and women who labour below still embody the same simple truth that Joseph Bazalgette once understood. Civilization isn't measured by what we build above ground, but by what we take care of beneath it. Walk the streets of London today, and you'd never guess that beneath your feet, rivers are still flowing. Not metaphorical ones of history or gossip, but real watery ghosts. The city that prided itself on conquering filth and taming nature did so by quite literally swallowing its own streams. The Fleet, the Tyburn, the Walbrook and others once wound their way through the city in silver ribbons. Now they rush unseen through brick tunnels, buried alive beneath pavements, tube lines and sandwich shops. London's underworld has more rivers than romance novels. Before the age of sewers and stone embankments, these rivers were the city's lifeblood. The Fleet ran from Hampstead through Clerkenwell to the Thames, where it once formed a small harbour. The Tyburn flowed from the hills of Marylebone down toward Westminster, its clear waters once feeding orchards and mills. The Walbrook trickled through what's now the heart of the financial district, its banks lined with Roman villas and early churches. Back then, London was a watery city, its map veined with streams that cooled, powered and nourished it. Then came progress, and progress has never been kind to rivers. As London swelled during the medieval and early modern eras, its streams became convenient dumping grounds. Tanneries, dye houses, and butchers' stalls crowded along the banks, turning blue water to brown. By the 17th century, the Fleet, once navigable by small boats, was so choked with refuse that even rats hesitated. Jonathan Swift famously mocked it in verse, describing its dung, guts and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud. When poets start writing odes to your filth, it's usually time for urban renewal. By the 18th century, most of London's rivers had lost the battle for daylight. Builders began covering them over with brick vaults, turning the open streams into culverts. The Fleet became the Fleet Ditch, then an underground drain, and finally a proper sewer. The Tyburn vanished under Mayfair's growing mansions, while the Walbrook disappeared beneath the Bank of England. Each burial was presented as progress, the city cleaning up its act. But in reality, London was entombing its history, one river at a time. Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer Network, built in the 19th century, was the final chapter in this watery disappearance act. His engineers didn't destroy the rivers, they simply absorbed them. Many of the new sewers followed the paths of ancient streams, enlarging them with brick and redirecting their flow. The Fleet, for instance, still runs beneath Farringdon Road, its current mingling with London's wastewater before joining the Thames. The Tyburn flows invisibly beneath Buckingham Palace, a royal river turned royal plumbing. The Walbrook, once sacred to the Romans, now courses through pipes beneath bank vaults, probably the only river in the world that passes under that much money. Even the names of streets whisper their liquid past. Fleet Street once echoed with the sound of rushing water long before it echoed with printing presses. Holborn, derived from hollow bourne, referred to the stream that once cut through the valley. Bayswater was named for a spring, Knightsbridge for a river crossing. Londoners walk these places daily, unaware that beneath the concrete water still murmurs, carrying the memory of a greener city. For all its triumphs in sanitation, Victorian London never completely silenced the rivers it buried. Occasionally after heavy rain, the old channels rebel, manhole covers rattle, basements flood, and the ghosts of the city's waterways briefly reclaim their territory. The Fleet, particularly, has a mischievous reputation, bursting forth during storms as if to remind the city that it is still there, just waiting for a crack in the masonry. Engineers call these incidents surcharge events. Poets call them justice. Explorers and urban historians have long been fascinated by these hidden rivers. Modern drainers, armed with flashlights and waterproof boots, venture into the tunnels to trace their ancient paths. They speak of vaulted brick ceilings, echoing chambers, and the eerie sound of unseen currents. The air smells of history, damp, mineral, and faintly rebellious. To walk through those tunnels is to time travel, to see how London layered itself like a geological sandwich. Roman ruins, medieval vaults, Victorian brick, and now electric cables and phone lines threading through the dark. What makes these ghost rivers remarkable is that they still serve the city. They are part of the same drainage system that keeps modern London dry, just as they once fed its fountains and moats. The transition from stream to sewer wasn't destruction so much as transformation. Nature pressed into service, tame but not erased. The water still flows, it's just that now it wears a uniform of brick and iron. And yet the romance persists. Artists, writers and dreamers still mourn the lost waterways, imagining London as it might have been, a city of bridges and canals rather than asphalt and traffic. Some propose daylighting them, uncovering sections of the buried rivers to let them breathe again. The idea sounds poetic until you realise that most of those rivers now carry more drain water than daffodils. Reviving them would mean negotiating centuries of pipes, tunnels and foundations, and explaining to property owners that their basement might need to become a tributary. Still, the idea of the ghost rivers continues to captivate because it speaks to something deeper than plumbing, the tension between the natural and the man-made. London has always been a city built in defiance of its geography, a place that paved over its own wetlands and dared to call it progress. The buried rivers are its conscience, whispering reminders from below that nature never really disappears. it simply changes course. So next time you walk down Fleet Street or stand outside Buckingham Palace, remember, beneath the clatter of traffic and the shuffle of tourists, water is still moving. It's ancient, unseen and patient, the pulse of an older London still beating below. The Victorians may have conquered their rivers, but the rivers, in their quiet persistence, have had the last laugh. More than a century and a half after Joseph Bazalgette first laid his bricks beneath the streets of London, the system he built still hums quietly below, doing what it has always done, protecting the living from what they leave behind. It is one of those rare Victorian achievements that never retired. The tunnels still carry the heartbeat of the city, still obey the pull of gravity, still drain the waste of millions who have long forgotten his name. Victorian toilets didn't just change hygiene, they flushed in modern civilization. Every day, 21st century London relies on an infrastructure designed in an era of gas lamps and horse-drawn omnibuses. The population Bazalgette built for, around 2.5 million souls, has now multiplied nearly fourfold, yet his system endures. The main intercepting sewers, enormous brick tubes large enough to drive a bus through, continue to ferry away waste as smoothly as the day they opened. Their craftsmanship was so meticulous, their geometry so precise, that engineers still marvel at their endurance. The mortar, made of Portland cement and Victorian stubbornness, has outlasted generations of architects. Modern engineers regularly descend into those tunnels with cameras and sensors scanning for cracks and wear. What they find, more often than not, is that the old work holds steady. The sewers have aged better than most of the buildings above them. It's a humbling reminder that while London's skyline has changed, from chimneys to glass towers, its foundations still rest on the genius of a man who thought ahead by a century. Bazalgette built not for his time, but for ours. Of course, London's waste has evolved with the times. The 19th century system was never designed for the modern horrors of wet wipes, cooking grease and synthetic sludge. The 2010s introduced the world to a new menace, the fatberg. These monstrous congealed masses of oil wipes and hubris have become the modern equivalent of dragons in the deep. Clearing them requires teams of specialists with high-pressure hoses, hazmat suits, and iron stomachs. Yet even these modern monstrosities are dealt with within Bazalgette's framework, proof that his tunnels can handle everything from coal soot to contemporary stupidity. To keep pace with the city's growth, engineers have spent decades reinforcing, upgrading and expanding his network. The most ambitious addition, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, often nicknamed the Super Sewer, began construction in the 2010s as a kind of 21st century tribute to Bazalgette's vision. It runs roughly parallel to the old Victorian system but dives deeper, designed to catch storm overflows that still pour into the Thames during heavy rain. The engineers behind it like to say they are finishing Bazalgette's job. One imagines the great man nodding approvingly, perhaps reminding them to make it twice as large, just in case. But beyond the pipes and the pumping stations, Bazalgette's legacy flows through every invisible comfort of modern urban life. Every shower, every sink, every unremarkable flush, all these moments of convenience rest on the principle he proved, that sanitation is civilization's first defense and its quietest triumph. His system turned cleanliness from a luxury into an expectation. We no longer thank engineers for clean water or safe streets, we assume both as birthrights. In that sense, Bazalgette succeeded too well. His greatest achievement is that most people never think about him at all. And yet, the influence of his work reaches far beyond London. His ideas shaped sanitation systems around the world, from New York to Sydney, from Paris to Mumbai. Engineers studied his methods, copied his gradients, and adopted his belief that infrastructure must serve not just the present, but the future. He inspired a new profession, the sanitary engineer, a hybrid of science, compassion, and bricklaying. In a century obsessed with grandeur, he proved that the true monuments of progress lie underground. Every now and then, London pauses to remember him. His name is carved modestly into the Victoria Embankment, just above the hidden tunnels that made it possible. Tour guides pointed out to visitors, explaining that the man who saved London's nose also saved its soul. His resting place in Wimbledon Cemetery is understated. No marble angels, just a simple grave for the man who gave a metropolis its second life. Modern historians rank him alongside the great reformers of his age: Florence Nightingale, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and Charles Dickens, yet Bazalgette's fame never quite reached theirs. Perhaps because his work, though miraculous, was never meant to be seen. There were no grand unveilings, no triumphant speeches. His success was measured in silence, in the absence of stink, in the health of children, in the disappearance of cholera from London streets. He built a revolution that smelled like nothing at all, and the system, astonishingly, still performs its duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It has survived wars, bombings, floods, and the occasional Fatberg uprising. During the Blitz, when bombs tore through London, many of Bazalgette's tunnels remained intact, providing both drainage and occasionally refuge. During modern heatwaves, when the Thames swells and sewers strain, the same brick vaults bear the pressure, a testament to an engineer who understood that good design endures because it's invisible. Perhaps that's the moral of London's long sanitary story. Progress doesn't always gleam or roar. Sometimes it trickles quietly through the dark, saving lives in silence. Bazalgette didn't just clean up a city. He changed how humanity thought about its own waste. Not as shame to be hidden, but as a problem to be solved. He turned disgust into discipline, and in doing so laid the groundwork for modern public health. When Londoners flush today, they don't hear the echoes of the great stink or the cries of the night soil men. They hear the calm gurgle of confidence, the sound of a city that trusts its own engineering. That trust is Bazalgette's true legacy, an unspoken partnership between the living and the dead, the past and the present, the visible and the buried. The Victorians dreamed of permanence, and in Bazalgette's sewers they achieved it. His tunnels may not sparkle like palaces or monuments, but they carry the rhythm of a living metropolis. Every drop that flows through them is a quiet salute to the man who made civilization safe to breathe again. And so every time we flush, we unknowingly participate in history, a brief, bubbling moment of gratitude to the engineer who taught the modern world that progress, like sewage, must always keep moving.